I had been wanting some time alone for a while. Life in the city had been nothing but noise, traffic, and constant demands. I rented a small cabin out in the woods, far from where cell service reached, and far from where neighbors could be seen or heard. It sat deep in a pine forest about 3 miles from the main road, with a dirt path leading to it that was barely wide enough for my truck. The pictures online had shown a quiet retreat with a simple wooden structure, a small porch, a fireplace, and enough space for someone like me to spend a week without distraction. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The drive out was long, with the road winding through stretches of trees that grew thicker the further I went. The last bit was nothing more than a bumpy trail, branches brushing against the sides of the truck as I slowly crawled my way to the clearing where the cabin stood. When I first pulled up, I felt a kind of relief. The air was fresher, the silence was heavy but peaceful, and for the first time in months, I thought maybe I could finally breathe without feeling like something was pressing on my chest. The cabin itself was as plain as expected. It was one story, built from dark logs that looked aged but sturdy. The porch was creaky, the door heavy, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of dust. Inside, it smelled like old wood and ash. There was a living area with a couch, a small table, and the fireplace against the wall. The bedroom had a single bed with a mattress that sagged slightly in the middle. The kitchen was nothing more than a counter, a sink, and a small stove powered by a propane tank outside. It was enough. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag down on the bed and stacking the groceries I had brought into the tiny fridge. I had planned to cook simple meals, read, write, and maybe take some walks in the forest. I wanted nothing complicated, just time. The first day went smoothly. I sat on the porch, drank coffee, and listened to nothing but wind moving through the trees. By evening, I had a fire going in the fireplace, though the night was not that cold. It was comforting, the crackling sound filling the silence of the cabin. I fell asleep early, thinking the week was going to be exactly what I needed. The first night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but the kind of restless feeling that pulls you out of sleep without reason. The cabin was completely dark except for the glow of the embers in the fireplace. I lay still for a while, hearing nothing but my own breathing. The silence was heavy, and I could feel the kind of quiet you notice in places where no traffic, no distant voices, no city hum ever reach. I eventually rolled over and went back to sleep. The second night, it was different. I had cooked a simple dinner and sat by the fire reading for a while before heading to bed. Again, sometime after midnight, I woke up. This time, I knew it was a sound. It had been faint, distant, but sharp enough that my body reacted before my mind caught up. I sat up in bed, listening hard. At first, there was nothing. Then, after a few minutes, I heard it again. A crack, like wood snapping, but not in the fireplace. It was outside, the kind of sound you hear when someone steps on a branch in the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. The forest was full of them, and deer or raccoons moving around would sound bigger than they really were. I forced myself to lie back down, but I couldn't shake the edge that had crept into me. My ears strained for every small noise, every shifting sound outside. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but it was restless. By the third night, I was starting to notice small things. During the day, I had gone for a walk down the path that led away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. The trees there were thicker, the ground uneven with roots, and it felt darker even though the sun was bright overhead. I didn't go too far, maybe a half mile, before turning back. On my way back, not far from the cabin, I noticed footprints in the dirt that weren't mine. They were faint, not sharp enough to be fresh, but they were shaped like boots. Someone had walked that way before me. That wasn't unusual, I told myself. The cabin wasn't on completely private land. There could have been hunters or hikers coming through at some point. Still, the thought of someone else moving through the trees near where I was staying left a knot in my stomach. That night, it happened again. I was pulled from sleep by a noise outside. This time, it wasn't just a branch snapping. It was slower, heavier, like the sound of something moving through leaves close to the cabin. I sat up, every muscle tense. I could hear my own heart pounding, and I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Maybe a bear, maybe a deer, But what kept me awake was how slow it had been. Like footsteps, I got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to look out. The moonlight made the clearing around the cabin faintly visible. I saw nothing. The porch was empty. The trees stood still. I stayed there for a long time, scanning the tree line, before finally crawling back into bed. By the fourth day, I was no longer relaxed. I kept glancing at the windows, listening for sounds even when the sun was up. I walked out onto the porch more than once, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, though I saw nothing each time. When night came, I left the fire burning brighter, hoping the light would keep anything away. It didn't help. I was woken again, this time by a sound against the cabin itself. A soft scrape, like something brushing against the wall. I froze in bed, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in me alive. The noise came again, closer to the window this time. Then it stopped. I didn't move until the sky outside began to pale with dawn. When I finally got up, I checked around the cabin. The dirt around the walls was undisturbed. No prints, no marks. I told myself I was imagining it, that being alone for days was making me hear things. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The fifth night broke me. I had stayed awake late, determined to catch whatever was happening. I sat in the dark living room with the fire low, staring at the window, waiting. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the clearing toward the cabin. Every muscle in me locked. The sound was clear this time, heavy on the dirt, stopping and starting. They came closer, then paused. I sat frozen, barely breathing, listening as they circled the cabin. My eyes were fixed on the front window, but nothing passed by. Then, softly, came the sound of the porch step creaking. Someone was out there, standing just feet away from me, separated only by the door. I stayed absolutely still, staring at the door, certain I would see the handle turn. It never did. After what felt like an hour, the sound faded, slow footsteps moving back into the trees until there was only silence again. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed my bag, loaded the truck, and decided I would leave. A week of peace wasn't worth this. But when I turned the key, the engine only clicked. Once, twice, again. Dead. I sat there gripping the wheel, my stomach sinking. I hadn't left the lights on. I hadn't drained the battery. There was no reason for the truck not to start, unless someone had done something to it. I got out, opened the hood, and stared at the engine. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to see the battery cables had been pulled loose. Not by accident. Someone had done it. I pushed them back into place, tightened them as best I could, and tried again. The engine turned over and roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was thin and shaky. Someone had been out here, close enough to touch my truck while I slept inside. I didn't even go back into the cabin. I left everything else and drove down the dirt path, branches scraping the sides, my eyes constantly checking the mirror. The whole way back to the road, I felt like I was being watched. When I finally reached the paved highway, I didn't stop. I drove until the trees thinned, until I saw other cars, until I was back in a town with people. Only then did I let myself breathe. The cabin had promised peace and quiet, but what I got instead was something I don't like to think about too long. I never saw who it was, and maybe that was worse. All I know is that someone was out there, walking the woods at night, circling the cabin, and close enough to tamper with my truck. I never went back for the things I left behind. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding roads through the thick forest, my car bouncing over uneven gravel, headlights cutting through the darkness. I was alone, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the faraway cry of a coyote. I had wanted a break from everything. City noise, constant demands, people constantly asking for something. But what I got was something I hadn't prepared for. The cabin I had booked was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Pictures online had promised quiet mornings, sunlight streaming through tall pine trees, and a small, warm cabin with a fireplace. Reality, as I quickly discovered, was entirely different. When I arrived, the gravel driveway had been overgrown, bushes scraping the sides of my car. The cabin looked small, maybe even cozy in daylight, but under the shadow of evening, it looked isolated, almost abandoned. The wood was dark, worn, and the windows reflected the forest like black mirrors. I felt a small shiver, but I told myself it was just the cold. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the wooden floor that creaked slightly under weight. The air smelled musty, a combination of damp wood and something earthy I couldn't immediately place. I had only my phone and a small bag of food, planning to stay for 2 nights. There was no Wi-Fi and the cell signal was patchy at best, which I had expected, but it made the silence feel even heavier. I tried to make the cabin feel like a home for those nights. I unpacked my bag, hung up a coat, laid out some clothes. Then I explored. The main room was small, with a fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs. There was a kitchen area, nothing fancy. Just an old stove, a sink with running water that smelled faintly metallic, and cupboards filled with dusty dishes. I ran my fingers over the counters, noting the scratches and small stains, signs that someone had used this space, maybe long ago. There was a bedroom down a short hall with a bed, blankets, and a small dresser. It smelled faintly of mothballs, and the mattress sagged in the middle. I pulled the blankets apart and laid them neatly on the bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I was stepping into someone else's space, someone who had left abruptly or maybe just stopped caring. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that almost sounded like voices, but not really. It was just the wind. I reminded myself of that several times. I checked my phone. It had barely any bars. I wasn't worried yet, but I thought about what would happen if I had a real problem. The nearest town was over 10 miles away, and the road here had been difficult to find in the dark. The map on my phone had shown a main route that didn't exist, and I had ended up driving down a narrow, unmarked path that led me here. I made a mental note to study the route back in daylight. I tried to eat, but the food I brought, granola bars, canned soup, tasted bland in the quiet. I boiled water on the stove and poured it over the soup, listening to the bubbling, tiny hissing sounds as steam rose into the air. I sat at the table, eating slowly, trying to enjoy the isolation I had craved. But something about the stillness felt too heavy. Every crack in the wood, every rustle of the trees, made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was normal. I had chosen this place. I had wanted solitude, but the forest had a way of making even small sounds feel ominous. By the time I finished eating, darkness had fully settled. The forest outside was black, a wall of shadows that seemed to press against the windows. I lit a single lamp on the table and watched the shadows dance across the walls. The cabin was old, and the wooden floors creaked with even the smallest movement. I tried to keep myself busy, checking supplies, cleaning a few dishes, but each noise outside made me pause. The wind, a branch hitting the side of the cabin, a distant animal call. My imagination filled in shapes, figures, movements I could not see. Around midnight, I went to bed. I had expected the quiet to be comforting, but the stillness felt wrong. I lay under the blankets, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, it was just the wind and the occasional animal. But after a while, I started noticing other sounds. A low scraping noise, distant and faint, like someone walking slowly across the porch. My heart started to beat faster, and I sat up, listening, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, scraping along the wood. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer next to the bed and shined it toward the door. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees swayed in the wind, shadows moving in ways that made it look like something crouched just beyond the cabin. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the sense of unease only grew. I considered leaving, driving back to town in the dark, but the road was narrow, and I didn't know it well. Plus, I had planned to stay here, and leaving now felt like admitting defeat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every noise, every creak. I finally fell asleep just before dawn, but it was fitful and shallow. When I woke, sunlight streamed weakly through the tall pines, and the forest looked less threatening. But I could still feel a tension in the air, something heavy that hadn't been there in the city. I made coffee and forced myself to eat something solid, trying to think logically. The scraping noise must have been a branch, maybe an animal, I reasoned. That's all. The day passed slowly. I went for a short walk along a nearby trail, observing the forest carefully. Tracks in the mud were confusing. Some looked like deer, some like humans. I made notes, careful not to wander too far. The isolation was striking, the quiet so complete it made me feel exposed. I returned to the cabin by late afternoon, locking the door, and tried to relax. I cooked a simple meal, organized my things, and read a book. By evening, the forest was alive again with noises, but I had grown slightly accustomed to them, knowing each sound had a source, even if I couldn't see it. The second night, however, things escalated. Around 11 p.m., I was lying in bed when I heard it again. The scraping, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. This time, I could hear multiple noises, soft footsteps circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. My stomach tightened. I grabbed the flashlight, checked every window and door, and everything seemed fine. I knew my mind was playing tricks, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. Every shadow seemed like a shape just beyond recognition. I felt trapped, the forest pressing in, the cabin small and fragile. Then I heard the knock, soft, deliberate, on the door. I could feel my body freeze. No wind could cause that. My mind raced. I looked for something to defend myself with and found an old metal poker near the fireplace. I gripped it tightly and went to the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. I peered through the small window. Empty. Nothing. But I could see footprints in the mud outside, circling the cabin. Human footprints. They were large, heavy, and wet from the recent rain. Panic set in. I realized someone had been outside, watching me, moving around while I slept. My first thought was to leave immediately, but it was dark, and I didn't know the road well. I locked the door and windows, pushed the table against the door, and sat in the corner with the poker. I stayed like that for hours, listening to every movement outside, waiting for something to happen. At first light, I cautiously opened the door. The footprints led into the forest and then stopped suddenly. No one was there. The porch was untouched otherwise, except for mud and leaves. I checked my car, it was fine. I debated calling the police, but with no cell signal, there was no immediate way. I realized I had to get to the main road, where I might find help. I packed quickly, keeping the poker close, and left, walking carefully along the driveway. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but my nerves were frayed. By the time I reached the main road, several hours later, I saw a passing car. I waved frantically and they stopped. I explained, barely able to catch my breath, that someone had been circling the cabin and I feared for my safety. They offered to drive me to the nearest town where I could call the police. The officers I spoke to took the situation seriously. They said that area was remote, sometimes used by squatters, and I was lucky to have noticed the signs early. The cabin was abandoned when they went to investigate. No one had been living there recently, but signs suggested someone had been there recently. Food wrappers, a makeshift fire pit, and footprints. They told me that sometimes people use remote cabins to hide or squat, and they had likely left once they realized someone had noticed. I was shaken, but I realized I had survived purely by noticing small details. The footprints, the noises, the signs of human presence. In the end, I stayed in town that night, sleeping in a hotel with locked doors and proper security. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the feeling of being watched, the ice. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding roads through the thick forest, my car bouncing over uneven gravel, headlights cutting through the darkness. I was alone, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the faraway cry of a coyote. I had wanted a break from everything. City noise, constant demands, people constantly asking for something. But what I got was something I hadn't prepared for. The cabin I had booked was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Pictures online had promised quiet mornings, sunlight streaming through tall pine trees, and a small, warm cabin with a fireplace. Reality, as I quickly discovered, was entirely different. When I arrived, the gravel driveway had been overgrown, bushes scraping the sides of my car. The cabin looked small, maybe even cozy in daylight, but under the shadow of evening, it looked isolated, almost abandoned. The wood was dark, worn, and the windows reflected the forest like black mirrors. I felt a small shiver, but I told myself it was just the cold. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the wooden floor that creaked slightly under weight. The air smelled musty, a combination of damp wood and something earthy I couldn't immediately place. I had only my phone and a small bag of food, planning to stay for 2 nights. There was no Wi-Fi, and the cell signal was patchy at best, which I had expected, but it made the silence feel even heavier. I tried to make the cabin feel like a home for those nights. I unpacked my bag, hung up a coat, laid out some clothes. Then I explored. The main room was small, with a fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs. There was a kitchen area, nothing fancy. Just an old stove, a sink with running water that smelled faintly metallic, and cupboards filled with dusty dishes. I ran my fingers over the counters, noting the scratches and small stains, signs that someone had used this space, maybe long ago. There was a bedroom down a short hall with a bed, blankets, and a small dresser. It smelled faintly of mothballs, and the mattress sagged in the middle. I pulled the blankets apart and laid them neatly on the bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I was stepping into someone else's space, someone who had left abruptly or maybe just stopped caring. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that almost sounded like voices, but not really. It was just the wind. I reminded myself of that several times. I checked my phone. It had barely any bars. I wasn't worried yet, but I thought about what would happen if I had a real problem. The nearest town was over 10 miles away, and the road here had been difficult to find in the dark. The map on my phone had shown a main route that didn't exist, and I had ended up driving down a narrow, unmarked path that led me here. I made a mental note to study the route back in daylight. I tried to eat, but the food I brought, granola bars, canned soup, tasted bland in the quiet. I boiled water on the stove and poured it over the soup, listening to the bubbling, tiny hissing sounds as steam rose into the air. I sat at the table, eating slowly, trying to enjoy the isolation I had craved. But something about the stillness felt too heavy. Every crack in the wood, every rustle of the trees, made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was normal. I had chosen this place. I had wanted solitude. But the forest had a way of making even small sounds feel ominous. By the time I finished eating, darkness had fully settled. The forest outside was black, a wall of shadows that seemed to press against the windows. I lit a single lamp on the table and watched the shadows dance across the walls. The cabin was old, and the wooden floors creaked with even the smallest movement. I tried to keep myself busy, checking supplies, cleaning a few dishes, but each noise outside made me pause. The wind, a branch hitting the side of the cabin, a distant animal call. My imagination filled in shapes, figures, movements I could not see. Around midnight, I went to bed. I had expected the quiet to be comforting, but the stillness felt wrong. I lay under the blankets, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, it was just the wind and the occasional animal. But after a while, I started noticing other sounds. A low scraping noise, distant and faint, like someone walking slowly across the porch. My heart started to beat faster, and I sat up, listening, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, scraping along the wood. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer next to the bed and shined it toward the door. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees swayed in the wind, shadows moving in ways that made it look like something crouched just beyond the cabin. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the sense of unease only grew. I considered leaving, driving back to town in the dark, but the road was narrow, and I didn't know it well. Plus, I had planned to stay here, and leaving now felt like admitting defeat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every noise, every creak. I finally fell asleep just before dawn, but it was fitful and shallow. When I woke, sunlight streamed weakly through the tall pines, and the forest looked less threatening. But I could still feel a tension in the air, something heavy that hadn't been there in the city. I made coffee and forced myself to eat something solid, trying to think logically. The scraping noise must have been a branch, maybe an animal, I reasoned. That's all. The day passed slowly. I went for a short walk along a nearby trail, observing the forest carefully. Tracks in the mud were confusing. Some looked like deer, some like humans. I made notes, careful not to wander too far. The isolation was striking, the quiet so complete it made me feel exposed. I returned to the cabin by late afternoon, locking the door, and tried to relax. I cooked a simple meal, organized my things, and read a book. By evening, the forest was alive again with noises, but I had grown slightly accustomed to them, knowing each sound had a source, even if I couldn't see it. The second night, however, things escalated. Around 11 p.m., I was lying in bed when I heard it again. The scraping, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening. This time, I could hear multiple noises, soft footsteps circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. My stomach tightened. I grabbed the flashlight, checked every window and door, and everything seemed fine. I knew my mind was playing tricks, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. Every shadow seemed like a shape just beyond recognition. I felt trapped, the forest pressing in, the cabin small and fragile. Then I heard the knock, soft, deliberate, on the door. I could feel my body freeze. No wind could cause that. My mind raced. I looked for something to defend myself with and found an old metal poker near the fireplace. I gripped it tightly and went to the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. I peered through the small window. Empty. Nothing. But I could see footprints in the mud outside, circling the cabin. Human footprints. They were large, heavy, and wet from the recent rain. Panic set in. I realized someone had been outside, watching me, moving around while I slept. My first thought was to leave immediately, but it was dark, and I didn't know the road well. I locked the door and windows, pushed the table against the door, and sat in the corner with the poker. I stayed like that for hours, listening to every movement outside, waiting for something to happen. At first light, I cautiously opened the door. The footprints led into the forest and then stopped suddenly. No one was there. The porch was untouched otherwise, except for mud and leaves. I checked my car, it was fine. I debated calling the police, but with no cell signal, there was no immediate way. I realized I had to get to the main road, where I might find help. I packed quickly, keeping the poker close, and left, walking carefully along the driveway. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but my nerves were frayed. By the time I reached the main road, several hours later, I saw a passing car. I waved frantically and they stopped. I explained, barely able to catch my breath, that someone had been circling the cabin, and I feared for my safety. They offered to drive me to the nearest town, where I could call the police. The officers I spoke to took the situation seriously. They said that area was remote, sometimes used by squatters, and I was lucky to have noticed the signs early. The cabin was abandoned when they went to investigate. No one had been living there recently, but signs suggested someone had been there recently. Food wrappers, a makeshift fire pit, and footprints. They told me that sometimes people use remote cabins to hide or squat, and they had likely left once they realized someone had noticed. I was shaken, but I realized I had survived purely by noticing small details. The footprints, the noises, the signs of human presence. In the end, I stayed in town that night, sleeping in a hotel with locked doors and proper security. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the feeling of being watched, the ice. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The idea of being completely alone in the wilderness, away from people, noise, and the constant hum of city life, had an almost magnetic pull on me. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. The owner had said it was rustic but livable, with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a well for water. They mentioned there was a nearby trail for hiking and a creek close by. The directions were simple enough, but once I left the paved roads, I realized how truly isolated the place was. The road narrowed into a dirt track, twisting through dense pine forests that filtered the light into green and gold patterns on the ground. Birds called occasionally, but mostly there was silence, thick and heavy. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures, maybe even smaller. It was built entirely of logs, with a tin roof that had rusted over time. The porch creaked under my weight as I set down my bag. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but there was something comforting about it. The interior was simple: a small kitchen with a wood stove, a single room with a bed, and a loft above, probably used for extra sleeping space. I unpacked slowly, trying to convince myself I was ready for the solitude, but there was a nervous energy that clung to me. The first day passed uneventfully. I chopped firewood, unpacked food, and explored the immediate surroundings. The creek near the cabin was clear and cold. I drank sparingly, careful to boil water over the stove for cooking. I took note of all the paths and landmarks, even though there was barely a trail to speak of. By nightfall, I had a fire going, which crackled and popped in the stove, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I felt a strange mixture of peace and unease, the kind that comes from being so completely alone. The next morning, I decided to hike along a trail the owner had mentioned. It was steep and winding, lined with thick underbrush, and the air smelled damp and earthy. About 2 hours in, I realized I had underestimated how disorienting the woods could be. The trail markers were faint, the trees all looked similar, and the sun had moved enough that I wasn't sure which direction would lead me back. I tried to retrace my steps, but soon, I understood that I was lost. Panic crept in slowly at first. My heart beat faster, but I forced myself to breathe and think logically. I remembered the creek from the cabin. Water usually leads back to something familiar. I moved cautiously, listening for the sound of running water. After what felt like hours but was likely only an hour, I heard it, a faint, rushing sound like a distant river. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly tempered by a creeping worry. If I moved too quickly, I could injure myself on the uneven forest floor, or worse, lose the trail again. When I finally reached the creek, I realized the problem wasn't solved. It curved and split into multiple small streams, and none seemed familiar. I sat on a rock, trying to calm myself. My supplies were fine for now, but I knew I couldn't wander the forest all day without risking serious trouble. I decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me to the cabin or a road. Hours passed. My legs ached, my shoes were soaked, and my stomach grumbled despite the snacks I carried. As evening approached, I realized I was still far from anywhere I recognized. The sun dipped lower, and the temperature dropped sharply. I had no choice but to stop and make a temporary camp. I found a flat area near the water and used some branches to make a rough shelter. I managed to start a small fire with the matches I carried, but it was small and fragile, and the smoke might attract unwanted attention from wildlife. Still, I was grateful for the warmth. That night, I lay awake, listening to the creek and the sounds of the forest. The rustle of small animals, the occasional call of a distant bird, and something heavier moving just beyond the line of firelight. My mind raced, thinking of bears or other predators. The following morning, I set out again, but the forest seemed endless. I began marking trees with small scratches from my knife, hoping to trace my path if needed. Hours blurred together. I was tired, hungry, and increasingly desperate. I realized my map-reading skills were worse than I thought, and I started questioning how I had gotten myself into this situation. At some point, I stumbled upon what looked like tire tracks in the dirt, old, partially overgrown, but possibly leading to some kind of human activity. Hope surged. I followed the tracks cautiously. As I moved along, I started noticing other signs. A discarded bottle, a broken branch at a low height suggesting someone had crouched or carried a load. The tracks were faint, but they seemed to lead somewhere. Eventually, I emerged into a clearing and saw the remnants of a small campsite. a rusted tent frame, a charred fire pit, and scraps of fabric caught in the underbrush. The sight was both reassuring and chilling. Someone had been here before, but apparently long ago. I pressed on, following the tracks and trying to maintain my sense of direction. By afternoon, I heard the faint sound of a truck engine in the distance. My heart leapt. I ran toward it, careful to remain visible, waving my arms. The truck turned out to belong to a forest ranger, doing patrols in the area. I explained as best as I could where I had come from and how I had gotten lost. Relief poured through me as he radioed for assistance. Within an hour, another ranger arrived, and together they guided me safely back to the cabin. Returning to the cabin that evening was surreal. The familiar walls felt like a sanctuary. I burned the firewood I had gathered earlier, cooked a full meal, and sat quietly, feeling the adrenaline drain from my body. I realized how easily something could have gone terribly wrong. The experience had shaken me, but it had also given me a new appreciation for preparedness, awareness, and respect for the wilderness. The next day, I packed my belongings, making sure nothing was left behind, and drove carefully down the dirt road back toward civilization. I stopped several times, looking back at the dense forest that had almost consumed me. The cabin had been a place of solitude and challenge, a test of endurance and judgment. It had been terrifying, but it had ended safely because of caution, persistence, and a bit of luck. The memory of that fear remained with me long after, a reminder that isolation in the wild is beautiful but must be approached with caution and preparation. I never returned to that cabin, but the experience changed me. I learned the value of careful planning, the necessity of carrying reliable tools and supplies, and the importance of remaining calm in frightening situations. More than anything, I realized that fear in the wilderness is real, tangible, and can be survived with patience, intelligence, and respect for the environment. I came back to the city, carrying that lesson, and though I sometimes longed for the solitude again, I knew I would never underestimate the power and unpredictability of the natural world. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. The idea of getting away from the city, the constant noise, and the people who seemed to demand my attention at every moment felt like a necessity. The cabin itself was deep in the forest, not a neighbor in sight, and it was far enough from the main road that the drive alone felt like a journey into a different world. I had taken the trip alone, which I thought would be a good way to clear my head, work on some personal projects, and just enjoy complete solitude. I had packed carefully, bringing enough food for several days, extra water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and of course the camera I always carried to document the landscape. I also had a small propane stove and some canned goods, knowing the nearest store was nearly 2 hours away if I needed anything. The drive to the cabin was uneventful at first. The sun was high, the sky clear, and the road stretched like a ribbon of black asphalt through dense pine forests. Birds were singing in the trees, and every so often I could see a squirrel dart across the road or a deer grazing just beyond the tree line. I remember feeling a sense of calm, a rare quiet in my head where I didn't think about work deadlines, text messages, or the constant hum of the city. By the time I reached the small dirt track that led to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and built entirely of dark, weathered wood. It wasn't modern by any means, but it had all the essentials: a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a single bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. One window overlooked a small clearing, and the other faced the dense forest. I had chosen it for its isolation, but I hadn't fully realized just how alone it would make me feel. There was no cell phone signal, and the cabin didn't have internet. Even though I had known this, standing on the porch, listening to the wind through the trees and the occasional distant bird call, I felt a tightening in my chest, a sense of vulnerability I hadn't expected. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I went inside, unpacked my things, set up the stove, and cooked a simple dinner. I ate while watching the last light of day fade from the clearing outside. The forest seemed to absorb all sound, and the silence was heavy in a way that felt almost alive. I went to bed early, thinking that the unfamiliar environment and the fresh air would make me sleep deeply. First, it did. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it, like a scraping or a dragging coming from outside. I froze, straining my ears. The wind was still, and the only sounds were those from deep in the forest. Whatever it was, it moved slowly. I tried to convince myself it was just the branches or an animal, but something about it didn't feel right. I kept my eyes open, staring at the small window beside my bed, but the darkness outside made it impossible to see anything beyond the faint outline of the trees. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the occasional snap or shuffle. By the time the sun began to rise, the sounds had stopped, but the unease remained. I went outside, scanning the area for any signs of what might have been moving around. There were faint tracks in the soft soil near the cabin, tracks that were too large to be a deer or a fox, but not quite human either. They were odd, almost indistinct, and I couldn't make sense of them. My first thought was that maybe it was some kind of large dog or a bear, but nothing felt certain. I spent the morning double-checking the cabin, locking doors and windows, and even securing the few small valuables I had brought. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went for a short hike on a trail that led from the clearing to a small creek. The forest was dense, with sunlight barely reaching the forest floor, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. It was peaceful, but I couldn't completely ignore the tension in my chest, the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack, made my heart race. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and I was exhausted. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, lighting the stove and making a pot of coffee. I tried to focus on reading, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. That night, the noises returned, this time louder and closer. There was a deliberate quality to them, like something was moving with purpose. I could hear the faint scrape of claws or shoes against the cabin siding, followed by the rustle of underbrush. I stayed in bed, gripping a small hammer I had brought along, trying to steady my breathing. The sounds continued for hours, stopping briefly only to start again, closer each time. The next morning, I discovered that a small section of the cabin's outer siding had been damaged. The wood had been scratched and gouged, and small pieces were missing, as if someone or something had tried to pry the wall open. Panic started to set in. I realized that I hadn't prepared for someone actually trying to get inside. The thought of being trapped in that isolated cabin with an intruder, or even a wild animal that seemed unusually aggressive, made my stomach turn. Over the following days, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The wind, once soothing, now sounded like it was pushing against the cabin, testing its structure. Birds that I had thought were peaceful seemed to follow me through the forest, their cries sharp and sudden. Every night, I slept with one eye open, one ear straining for any hint of movement outside. I began barricading the doors and windows as best as I could, using furniture and heavy objects. I even considered leaving, but the dirt road was long, and I knew I wouldn't make it to the main road safely if something was following me. On the fourth night, the noises became almost constant. Scratches, thumps, and the occasional crunch of footsteps on the soft ground outside. I could see shadows moving just beyond the clearing when the moonlight hit the trees. My nerves were frayed. I started keeping the lights on in the cabin, moving from room to room with the hammer in my hand, trying to be ready for whatever might come through the door. My mind started imagining all sorts of scenarios, most of them terrifying, and I realized that I was no longer simply anxious. I was afraid for my life. I remember the moment I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed as quickly as I could, trying not to make any noise, and I double-checked all the doors. I stepped outside, gripping my backpack and the hammer, and started moving down the dirt track toward the main road. The forest seemed alive around me, every crack, snap, and rustle making my heart leap. I kept moving, never stopping, until I finally reached a place where I could see the main road. A car drove past, and I ran toward it, waving frantically until the driver noticed me. I was taken back to town, exhausted, covered in scratches and dirt, but safe. The police later investigated the cabin. They found signs of break-ins and large animal tracks nearby, likely a bear, but there was also evidence of human trespassing. I realized that it could have been either or both, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I survived. I never returned to the cabin, and I never tried to seek solitude in that forest again. The memory of those nights, the sounds, the fear, the isolation, stayed with me, a constant reminder of how small and vulnerable I could be when removed from civilization. Over time, I rebuilt my sense of safety, but the experience changed me. I began to appreciate human connection more, to value the presence of others even in the quietest moments. I also learned that solitude isn't always peaceful, and that sometimes the world outside the city can be just as dangerous as anything you might imagine. The cabin, once a dream of escape, became a symbol of how quickly calm can turn into fear, and how important it is to prepare for the unexpected. Every time I hear about someone seeking isolation in the wilderness, I think of that place, and I warn them not to underestimate how unpredictable nature and people can be. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't something I did often. I usually preferred the comfort of my apartment in the city, surrounded by people, the convenience of running water, electricity, and the constant noise of urban life. But this time, I wanted something different, something that would force me to disconnect, to be completely alone in the wilderness. I found a cabin online, a small, rustic place tucked away in a dense forest about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The pictures were simple: a wooden cabin with a steep roof, a stone chimney, and a little porch facing a small clearing. There were no signs of civilization nearby, no electricity, no cell service, just the kind of isolation I had imagined when I booked it. I drove out early in the morning, loaded with a backpack full of supplies: food, water, clothes, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, and a small camping stove. I had told myself I didn't need much more than that. I wanted to keep it simple, to challenge myself. The drive itself was uneventful at first, the asphalt road gradually giving way to gravel, then dirt, and finally a narrow path surrounded by tall, thick trees. By the time I reached the parking area near the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the dense canopy, scattering golden light over the forest floor. The cabin was even smaller and more isolated than I had imagined. It sat at the end of a barely visible trail, surrounded by thick underbrush. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the wood was dark and weathered, but it had a solid, sturdy look. I parked my car nearby, grabbed my backpack, and walked the short distance to the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I could hear birds settling down for the night and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. It was quiet in a way I had never experienced before, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making your own movements seem loud and intrusive. I opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was small, no larger than a single room, with a loft above that seemed accessible by a narrow wooden ladder. A small fireplace sat against the far wall, its chimney darkened from use. There was a wooden table and 2 chairs, a small bed tucked into the corner, and a tiny kitchenette with a sink, a few cabinets, and a counter. The place smelled faintly of wood and something older, maybe a combination of years of use and dampness seeping in through the walls. It wasn't luxurious, but it was livable. I unpacked my things slowly, setting the backpack down, spreading out my clothes, and stacking the food in the small cupboards. I checked the fireplace. It hadn't been cleaned recently, but there was enough dry wood stacked nearby to start a fire if needed. As the sun dipped completely below the horizon, the cabin grew colder. I could feel the temperature drop within minutes. I lit a small lantern I had brought, setting it on the table, its warm yellow light illuminating the room. It felt cozy in contrast to the darkness outside. The first night was surprisingly uneventful. I made a small meal on the camping stove, then sat in one of the chairs, staring at the forest beyond the windows. The wind whispered through the trees, creating long, drawn-out groans as it bent branches and stirred leaves. Occasionally, I thought I heard something moving just outside, a branch snapping or leaves rustling, but it was probably just the wind or an animal. I reminded myself that I wasn't in any real danger. I wasn't far from the car, I had my supplies, and the forest was full of animals more afraid of me than I was of them. I slept fitfully on the small bed, the thin mattress doing little to cushion the uneven floor beneath it. Every time I woke, I thought I heard something, scratching, scurrying, footsteps that weren't quite human. My mind, I realized, was on high alert because of the isolation. The silence made every sound sharper, louder, and more threatening than it actually was. I spent the first morning checking the perimeter of the cabin, making sure there were no signs of recent wildlife activity too close to the building. Everything seemed normal. Animal tracks, some broken branches, but nothing alarming. I told myself to relax. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. I collected firewood, walked the surrounding trails, took notes about plants and small signs of wildlife, and cooked my meals slowly, deliberately, savoring the silence. The isolation was both peaceful and unnerving. On one particular day, I decided to hike farther than usual, following a narrow trail deeper into the forest. The sun was high, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I walked for hours, noting how the trees changed, how the underbrush became denser, and how the light filtering through the canopy shifted from warm yellow to a muted green. By the time I turned back, the sky was already tinged with orange, and I realized I had lost track of time. The trail back to the cabin was less obvious. The markers I had noticed earlier seemed different in the fading light. I quickened my pace, but the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. Branches scraped my arms and face, roots threatened to trip me, and every shadow looked like it could conceal something larger, something watching. I reached a clearing and finally spotted the cabin in the distance, a small dark shape among the trees, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. That night, I had difficulty sleeping. Every creak of the cabin, every scratch from outside made me tense. I kept the lantern lit until I felt almost delirious with fatigue. My mind began to exaggerate every sound. The wind outside sounded like low, guttural voices whispering, the branches tapping against the windows like fingernails. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination. But the feeling of being watched persisted. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, though I knew I was probably being paranoid. The next day, I woke early to continue my exploration of the surrounding forest. I wanted to document animal tracks, photograph the flora, and generally understand the environment I was in. Around mid-morning, I heard a sound that made my stomach tighten. A loud, deliberate snap of a branch, much too large to be a small animal. I froze, trying to listen. The forest went silent for a moment. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I crouched behind a tree, straining to see through the dense foliage. There was nothing at first, just trees and shadows. Then I saw movement. A large figure, hunched, moving steadily but slowly among the trees. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The way it moved was odd, too deliberate, too careful. My heart began to race. I debated running, but I didn't want to make noise. I watched as it moved further away, eventually disappearing behind a thick stand of pines. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a hunter or someone else camping, I reasoned, though no one had told me about anyone else being in this part of the forest. I returned to the cabin that afternoon, tense but determined not to let my imagination run wild. I reinforced the locks on the door, stacked extra firewood against the porch just in case, and kept my backpack ready near the door with the flashlight and a small kitchen knife I had packed. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder, more deliberate. The wind, the branches, the distant rustling. I couldn't tell which was natural and which wasn't. I stayed awake for hours, watching the forest through the window, waiting, imagining, preparing. The following morning, I decided to investigate further. I didn't want to be trapped inside my own fear, so I gathered some supplies and set out cautiously along the trail I had hiked before. Everything was normal at first. The birds, the sun filtering through the leaves, the occasional squirrel darting across the path. But as I moved deeper, I began to notice signs. Disturbed underbrush, broken branches, and footprints too large and deep to be small animals. The footprints were spaced far apart, suggesting a large, heavy creature moving quickly. My stomach dropped. I realized with growing dread that whatever it was, it had been following me. I retraced my steps cautiously, staying off the main trail, moving slowly to avoid making noise. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made me stop. I checked behind every tree and large rock, but I never saw it directly. Then, in a small clearing, I saw the footprints clearly for the first time. Large, irregular, deep in the soft soil. They led from the deeper forest toward my cabin. My pulse quickened. I knew it had been watching me, following me, and there was no way to know how close it was now. I ran back to the cabin, my legs burning, my lungs gasping for air. I barely paused to close the door behind me. I barricaded it with chairs and firewood, checked all the windows, and armed myself with the flashlight and knife. I knew I couldn't stay outside. The forest was too dense and the creature too large. I stayed awake all night, listening, eyes darting to every shadow, every movement outside. Sometimes I thought I heard it sniffing around the cabin, scraping at the walls. I had been driving all day to reach the cabin I had rented for a week in the northern woods. The road had been narrow, winding, and often unpaved, stretching for hours past farmland, old gas stations, and patches of abandoned homes. By the time I reached the last turnoff, the sun was sinking low behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the rough asphalt. I parked the car at the edge of a small clearing, the cabin barely visible behind a row of tall pine trees. It was small, rustic, and isolated, exactly what I had hoped for when I decided to escape the city for a while. I had imagined quiet mornings, coffee on the porch, and evenings spent reading by the fire. I had not imagined the unease that would settle in my stomach almost immediately. The cabin looked normal enough, with weathered wood and a chimney that showed signs of use. The windows were dusty but intact. As I carried my bags inside, I noticed how silent it was, except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the whisper of the wind through the pines. No birds, no insects, just a heavy quiet that seemed to press against my ears. I brushed it off as part of being somewhere so remote. People in the city always complained about noise, I reminded myself, but here silence was overwhelming. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke, the remnants of previous visitors. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the stove looked functional. I set my bags down and unpacked slowly, taking time to notice every detail. The walls had small cracks, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and a thin layer of dust covered most surfaces. As I walked around, I noticed the small things that made the cabin feel lived in, even if no one had been there for months. A pair of old boots by the door, a half-used roll of paper towels, an old calendar from 2 years prior. Everything spoke of normalcy, yet the quiet gnawed at me. It was not the comforting kind of quiet. It felt heavy, patient, like it was waiting. I spent the first evening settling in. I lit the stove, made a simple meal, and sat at the table eating slowly while staring out the window at the darkening forest. Night fell quickly, faster than I expected. By the time I was done, the sky was black, and the only light came from the cabin itself. I went outside briefly to stretch, noticing the way the trees moved in the wind, their shadows long and twisted under the moonlight. Even then, I felt watched, not by any person or animal, but by the emptiness itself, the vastness around me. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. Isolation did strange things to the mind. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every sound in the cabin seemed amplified. The floor creaking as the wood settled, the wind rattling the windows, a distant thump that could have been a branch falling. I kept checking the locks, making sure the windows were secure, the door firmly latched. I told myself I was being cautious, not paranoid. But as I lay in the darkness, my ears straining for any sound, I realized that the forest had its own rhythm, a presence that I could not ignore. Something about it made my skin crawl. I do not remember when I finally fell asleep, only that the night outside seemed longer than it should have been, stretched out by shadows and wind. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of a bird or maybe a small animal outside. Light spilled through the windows, revealing dust motes floating in the air. I moved slowly, aware of the strange tightness in my chest that had not been there the day before. I made breakfast, boiled water for coffee, and sat by the window, staring into the forest. It seemed peaceful in the daylight, yet the isolation was still palpable. I decided to take a walk along the small trail that led from the cabin, to stretch my legs and let the daylight reassure me. I stayed on the path, careful not to stray, noting the details around me. Fallen pine needles, the smell of damp earth, the occasional bird call. Yet, the further I walked, the more I noticed things that felt off. The way some of the trees seemed unnaturally close together, the way shadows pooled in corners of the trail even under bright sunlight, the occasional rustle that had no visible source. Returning to the cabin, I found myself double-checking everything again. Doors, windows, stove, firewood. I began to notice how exposed the cabin was. Even though it was set back from the road, any visitor could easily approach without being noticed until they were right at the door. I rationalized it. The area was remote, not frequented by anyone, but I could not shake the feeling that someone could have been here just before me, leaving behind a faint trace of presence. Maybe it was the boots, the old calendar, the smell of lingering smoke. I did not know, and I felt my unease growing quietly in the back of my mind. By the third day, the sense of isolation had intensified. I began to notice small details that previously escaped me. The floorboards in the living room creaked differently, almost as if they were bearing weight in the wrong places. Outside, the trail I had walked appeared subtly changed. Broken twigs, a scuff mark on the dirt path, footprints I was almost certain I hadn't left. I told myself I was imagining things, but the gnawing worry in my chest grew. I avoided looking out the windows at night, instead sitting near the stove, its warmth a small comfort against the chill that crept into the cabin. Even with the stove lit, the shadows in the corners seemed heavier, thicker, as if they were clinging to the walls. By the fourth day, I realized I was sleeping less. Every sound woke me. The wind, the trees, the distant thump of something moving outside. I began keeping a small hatchet near the bed, a precaution I had not intended when I first arrived. I rationed food carefully, thinking I might need to be here longer than planned if something went wrong. Every time I opened a window, I felt exposed, but I also felt compelled to check for movement outside. I started marking small things on paper, writing down times when I heard unusual noises, trying to make sense of the pattern that I felt but could not see. The fifth day, things escalated. I woke to a distinct sound, almost like someone stepping on the porch. I froze, listening. The wind shifted, and the sound faded. I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks, but I could not relax for the rest of the day. I did not go outside at all, staying near the stove, listening, eyes darting to every window. The silence outside became suffocating. I thought about leaving, about packing my bags and driving back immediately, but the road was long, and I had come here for solitude. The very thing I sought was now the source of terror. By the sixth day, I had stopped trusting my own perception. Shadows in the cabin moved in ways I knew they shouldn't. Small noises, like the creak of a floorboard, set my heart racing. I started keeping the cabin lights on constantly. I blocked the windows with whatever I could find, blankets, furniture, anything to give me a sense of safety. Even then, I could not ignore the feeling that I was being watched, studied from the forest. I realized I had underestimated the psychological impact of isolation. It was not just the emptiness. It was the constant potential for someone, or something, to intrude without warning. I started thinking about the animals in the area, the rare chance that a person might be near, and the worst-case scenarios that my mind could imagine. The seventh day was the worst. I woke before dawn, sweating and trembling. I had heard clear footsteps around the cabin during the night. The door was still locked, the windows intact, yet every instinct screamed that someone had been there. I moved silently, checking every corner, examining the porch, the surrounding trees. Nothing was there, but the prints in the dirt confirmed movement, footprints that were too large to be mine. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to think. I needed a plan, not hysteria. I packed a bag with essentials: food, water, my phone, the small hatchet, and a flashlight. I decided I would leave at first light, but then I realized the weight of isolation had distorted my sense of safety. I could not just leave calmly. I had to be vigilant. As daylight crept into the clearing, I stepped carefully onto the porch, scanning the forest. The footprints were gone, but I could see broken branches, subtle disturbances that indicated someone had been moving nearby. I kept my bag ready, my hatchet in one hand, and moved slowly toward the car. Every sound in the woods, bird calls, wind, the crunch of leaves under my feet, made my pulse spike. I stayed alert, watching the tree line constantly. Halfway to the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop: a fresh mark in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. It was deliberate, a single, straight line. I picked up the pace, heart hammering. When I reached the car, I locked myself inside, checked the doors, and started the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something, but saw only the dense trees and shadows. I drove slowly at first, then faster as the road opened. Every mile back to the main road, every familiar landmark. I had always wanted a place of my own in the woods, somewhere quiet where I could escape the noise of the city, the endless hum of people, cars, and lights. I found an old cabin listed online, tucked deep in a patch of forest that sprawled across the hills of northern Maine. The photos showed a simple, rough-hewn wooden structure, surrounded by pine trees so thick that in the pictures, the sunlight barely touched the ground. It was small, maybe 3 rooms, with a tiny kitchen, a loft for sleeping, and a wood-burning stove. The cabin was unconnected to the grid, which suited me perfectly. I liked the idea of being on my own, of having no one else around for miles. When I first saw it in person, the air smelled of wet earth and moss, and the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant babble of a creek. Felt like it had been waiting for me. I spent the first day unpacking my things and arranging them carefully. I had brought food, a few cans and jars, bottled water, and a small camping stove just in case. The woodpile outside was stacked haphazardly but solid, and I immediately collected kindling from the forest floor, dry twigs and fallen branches to feed the stove. The cabin itself was dusty, and I spent hours cleaning, wiping down the counters, brushing off cobwebs, and sweeping the floor. As I moved about, I could hear the occasional crack of wood outside, the subtle movements of animals. I kept my rifle leaned in the corner, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked the comfort of having it near me. Night fell fast. The forest swallowed the last light of day, and the darkness was so thick it made the cabin feel smaller, more enclosed. I lit the stove and sat close to it, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and a faint scraping came from the roof, probably a branch. I reminded myself that everything I could hear had a logical explanation. Still, there was a tension in the air, a certain weight of isolation that made my skin crawl. I stayed up late, listening to the occasional rustle of something moving through the leaves outside. By midnight, exhaustion won, and I crawled into the loft, bundled under a blanket, telling myself that nothing would happen, that the forest was just a quiet, living thing. The next morning, I woke to an uneasy feeling. The air smelled damp, like rain had just passed through, and the ground outside was slick with mud. I went to the small kitchen area, boiled water, and made coffee. As I sipped, I looked out the single window toward the tree line and noticed something strange: the footprints in the mud. At first, I thought I had missed them before, but these were fresh, human footprints, not my own. They circled near the cabin, disappeared into the trees, and then returned. My heart started to race. I had expected wildlife, deer, raccoons, but humans? The idea made me tense, alert. I grabbed the binoculars I had brought and scanned the forest. There was nothing, just trees swaying gently in the morning wind. I told myself someone was probably hiking nearby and had passed the cabin. Still, I made a mental note to stay cautious. I decided to go into the woods for a walk, hoping to see the trail more clearly and figure out if the footprints were part of a path. The forest was dense, and the ground was uneven, muddy in places and littered with fallen branches. I followed the tracks carefully, stepping lightly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The tracks seemed random, not a clear path. They wandered close to the creek, dipped into small thickets, and eventually disappeared near a steep slope. I felt a growing unease, a subtle sense that I was being watched. I scanned the trees constantly, listening for any unusual sounds, any hint that someone was following me. There was nothing, only the wind, birds, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I returned to the cabin later in the afternoon, but the feeling didn't leave me. As I approached, I saw that the door, which I had firmly closed that morning, was slightly ajar. I froze. I was certain I had locked it. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the rifle. I stepped inside carefully, checking every corner. Nothing was out of place. No signs of forced entry, no disturbance beyond the door itself. Still, the cabin suddenly felt smaller, more vulnerable. I checked the windows. They were all intact, with no marks on the glass. I bolted the door from the inside, double-checking the lock, and tried to convince myself that maybe I hadn't shut it all the way. But deep down, I knew I had. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound, the creak of the roof, the wind shifting through the trees, the scuttling of something in the underbrush, made me tense. Around midnight, I heard it, a deliberate, slow scraping at the side of the cabin. It wasn't high-pitched or frantic. It was low, methodical. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the rifle and moved quietly to the window. The forest beyond was dark, shadows of trees swaying. I couldn't see anything, but the sound came again, closer this time, around the corner of the cabin. I felt trapped, exposed, with no immediate way to defend myself other than the rifle and my own fear. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, sweat running down my face, heart pounding. Finally, exhaustion forced me back to the loft, rifle in hand, ready to fire if needed. The following day, I decided to take proactive measures. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, inspecting for signs of someone trying to enter. I found subtle marks in the dirt, scuffs on the siding, and even small twigs bent as if someone had crouched there recently. The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't random. Someone had been near the cabin, possibly watching me for days, and had returned at night. I considered leaving, but the cabin was remote, and the nearest town was over 30 miles away. I had supplies for a week, and I decided that if I could secure the place, I could wait them out and figure out what to do next. I reinforced the door and windows as best I could. I dragged heavy furniture against the door, jammed sticks in the window frames, and set up simple traps outside. Branches that would snap and make noise if someone tried to sneak up. I also cleared a line of sight around the cabin, breaking branches and cutting small trees to reduce hiding spots. By evening, the cabin felt slightly safer, but the tension never left. I stayed near the stove, rifle in hand, listening. Every sound made me flinch. When night came, I positioned myself in the loft, where I could see the door and windows, and waited. The second night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement just beyond the treeline. Leaves rustled, small branches snapped. I caught a glimpse of a shadow, fleeting, moving too fast to be a deer. My heart raced. I didn't fire, knowing I couldn't see clearly enough, but I stayed alert. Over the next hour, I heard more movement. Scraping, soft thuds, faint whispers of sound. But no one approached the door directly. It was as if they were circling, testing, waiting. I stayed perfectly still until dawn. By the third day, I had established a routine. I didn't leave the cabin unless necessary, and then only during daylight. I reinforced my perimeter, gathered extra wood, and kept a constant watch on the forest. The forest, which had felt peaceful at first, now felt hostile, almost alive in a way that made me nervous. Every animal I saw, every bird that flew overhead, every squirrel that scurried across the ground reminded me that I was alone and exposed. I couldn't tell if the person or people who had been near the cabin were still around or if they had left, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. On the fourth day, the tension reached a breaking point. I had gone outside to refill my water from the creek when I noticed something carved into the tree near the cabin. A crude symbol, maybe an attempt at a warning or marking. It was fresh, the bark still damp. I realized then that someone had been extremely close to my cabin while I was outside, possibly watching. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm. I returned quickly, checking the perimeter for further signs. There were footprints leading away from the tree toward the forest, but they disappeared within a few hundred feet. I couldn't tell if they had left or were lying in wait. That night, I did something I hadn't done before. I rigged a few noise-making traps around the cabin perimeter using cans, twine, and some spare materials. The idea was simple. Any movement near the cabin would trigger a sound and alert me. I placed them strategically near the door, windows, and along the path I had walked from the creek. I also stayed awake longer, rifle ready, listening for the slightest sound. Around midnight, one of the cans clanged. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the rifle and crept toward the window. I saw movement, just a shadow, darting from one tree to another. They were cautious, deliberate, keeping to the dark, moving around the traps. I didn't fire. I just watched, adrenaline coursing through my body. The shadow paused, crouched, and after a long minute, ran off deeper into the forest. My hands were shaking as I lowered the... I had always wanted to get away from the city, from the noise, from the constant pressure and obligations that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The idea of a cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, miles from the convenience stores, the phones, and the endless traffic, had appealed to me for years. I found a listing online for a small, isolated cabin near the edge of a dense national forest. It was old but sturdy, built from heavy pine logs, with a steep metal roof that glinted in the sunlight and a stone chimney that looked like it had been part of the landscape for decades. The photos were rustic but charming, showing a tiny porch with a swing, a woodpile neatly stacked against one side, and a small garden that had obviously been abandoned for years. The price was low, and I had no one to answer to, so I booked it for a long weekend. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The GPS guided me through increasingly narrow and winding roads. At first, the trees were spaced out, patches of farmland and meadows breaking up the forest. But gradually, the road narrowed into a single lane of cracked asphalt, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. There was no one else on the road. Every so often, I would pass a turnoff with an old sign barely legible through the moss and ivy, but I had no idea where they led. The sky above was a pale blue, the kind of blue that makes you feel both calm and strangely exposed at the same time. By the time I turned onto the final dirt road that led to the cabin, the forest had swallowed everything else. The road was rutted and uneven, making my car bounce sharply with every dip. Fallen branches littered the edges, and the smell of damp earth and pine resin filled the air. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, not just quiet in the usual sense, but an almost unnatural silence, as if the forest itself had absorbed all sound. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, my relief was immediate. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees on all sides, the kind of isolation I had imagined for months. The cabin itself was even more rugged up close. The wood smelled of age and smoke, the metal roof had patches of rust, and the stone chimney was cracked in a few places. The windows were dusty and opaque, making the interior look dark and unwelcoming. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking on the old boards, and grabbed the keys I had been sent. The door opened easily, the hinges groaning as I pushed it aside. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners, but everything was intact. The main room had a small wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a single armchair pushed into the corner. A small loft above promised sleeping space, accessed by a rickety wooden ladder. I set down my bag and walked through the small kitchen area. There was a tiny sink, a worn countertop, and cabinets that squeaked when I opened them. There was no running water, no electricity, and no cell service. For a moment, the lack of connectivity thrilled me, but it also made my chest tighten. I was utterly alone. I unpacked my few belongings, lit a fire in the stove, and sat in the armchair. Outside, the forest seemed to press closer with every passing hour, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I could hear the distant sound of water somewhere nearby, maybe a stream or a river, but it was faint and intermittent. I was happy, though also aware that the isolation I had sought was now very real, tangible in a way that made me conscious of every sound and every movement. That first night, I slept lightly, waking several times to the sound of branches scraping against the cabin walls, leaves rustling in a way that made me startle each time. The wind had picked up, and it moaned through the gaps in the logs. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, but when I froze and listened, the sound ceased. By morning, I had convinced myself it had been my imagination. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I wanted to see how far the isolation really went, how deep the woods extended. The terrain was uneven, the ground covered in fallen leaves, broken branches, and thick underbrush. I marked my starting point on a small map I had drawn based on satellite images, intending to stick to a rough loop so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was dense, and the air smelled of damp moss and decaying leaves. Birds called to each other in the distance, but otherwise the forest was silent. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every tiny noise. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife, tracks in the soft soil, claw marks on the bark of trees, and piles of animal droppings. I saw a few deer in the distance, watching me with wide eyes before disappearing into the trees. I knew the area was known for black bears, and I carried a small canister of bear spray, but I felt strangely calm. The deeper I went, the more isolated it became. Eventually, I lost sight of the cabin entirely, the tall pines and thick undergrowth cutting me off completely from any view of the clearing. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I turned back, but the path I had come on was harder to follow than I remembered. Branches had fallen across the ground, and small streams had shifted the dirt, obscuring my tracks. The sunlight was fading, the forest growing darker and colder with each step. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, a creeping anxiety I couldn't shake. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I knew the general direction of the cabin. But as twilight deepened, the forest transformed into a maze of shadows and shapes, the once familiar terrain now alien and threatening. I walked faster, crunching over leaves and roots, but the trees seemed to stretch endlessly. The darkness grew dense, and I could no longer make out any of the landmarks I had noted earlier. Panic started to rise. My heart thudded in my chest, and sweat made my clothes cling to my skin. Every sound, an animal moving in the underbrush, the snap of a twig, the rush of wind through the branches, made me jump. I began to realize that I had no choice but to keep moving, to follow some internal sense of direction toward the cabin. Night fell completely, and I was still lost. I stopped in a small clearing, trying to catch my breath and think clearly. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet in front of me, leaving the rest of the forest in impenetrable darkness. I knew I could not stay still for long. Temperatures were dropping, and exposure could become dangerous. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, being lost until morning, encountering a wild animal, injuring myself on the uneven ground. Then I heard it, the low, guttural growl of a bear. My blood froze. I had known bears were in the area, but hearing one so close in complete darkness made my stomach tighten. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. The growl was followed by the snapping of branches, the brush moving with deliberate force. I raised the bear spray, my hands trembling, and tried to remain calm. I remembered the advice I had read. Do not run, make yourself appear large, and back away slowly. But the darkness made it impossible to see the animal, and I had no idea which way was safe. I started to back away slowly, keeping the flashlight on, scanning the shadows. The growling followed me, closer now, punctuated by heavy breathing and the snapping of more branches. Fear surged through me, raw and intense, sharper than anything I had ever experienced. My lungs burned, my heart pounded, and every instinct screamed to flee. I stumbled over a root and fell, scraping my hands and knees, and the bear growled again, closer. My adrenaline spiked, giving me the strength to push to my feet. I ran, not in a controlled way, but blindly, crashing through the underbrush, guided only by memory and instinct. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught my feet, and every fall made me fear the bear would catch up. The sound of the animal behind me was relentless, its growl and the breaking of branches echoing through the forest. I didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. All I knew was that I had to reach the cabin, to reach safety, to reach something solid and familiar. After what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, I broke through the trees and saw the faint outline of the cabin in the darkness. Relief washed over me so intensely it almost made me stumble again. I ran the last few dozen feet, threw myself through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The cabin shook as I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. I locked the door, stacked a few heavy pieces of firewood against it, and crouched near the stove, shaking. The forest outside was silent now. Whether the bear had retreated or lost interest, I could not know. I stayed awake the rest of the night, adding more wood to the fire, listening for every sound, knowing that the wilderness I had romanticized was unforgiving and real. The next morning, I emerged cautiously, surveying. I had been planning this trip for months, the idea forming almost obsessively in my mind during long, uneventful days at work. It was supposed to be a simple escape, a break from the endless hum of city life, the buzzing of cars, the constant glare of screens, and the suffocating routines that made every day feel indistinguishable from the last. I wanted silence, I wanted isolation, I wanted a place where the nearest human being might be miles away and the only noises would be the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, and the slow, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I had found a cabin online, tucked deep into the mountains, far from the nearest town. The pictures looked promising, rough but solid, wooden, with a small porch overlooking a narrow valley and a stream that glimmered like silver in the sunlight. I imagined mornings standing on that porch, coffee in hand, watching fog drift lazily over the hills. The drive was long. I left early in the morning, the air crisp with the early hint of spring. The city gradually receded behind me, the concrete giving way to rolling hills, then dense forests, and finally steep mountain roads that twisted sharply, sometimes narrowing to a single lane with sheer drops on the side. My old car protested at times, the engine whining as it labored up the inclines. I had packed lightly, just a backpack with essentials, a few cans of food, water, my sleeping bag, and some books. I didn't bring much because I wanted to rely on the cabin's supplies, which were described as basic but adequate. I wanted the trip to feel like an experiment in self-sufficiency. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, the sun was hanging low, golden and heavy in the sky. The road became dirt, pocked with ruts and stones, and I slowed, knowing that any mistake here could mean sliding off into the ravine. The GPS barely worked. I had to rely on the printed directions I had brought, marking turns by rocks and trees, counting the number of curves and bends. Eventually, I saw it. A dark wooden shape among the trees, almost hidden, its roof low and shingles old but intact. The porch was as pictured, with a few rocking chairs that had faded to gray. The smell of pine was heavy and sweet, mingling with the damp scent of moss and wet earth. I parked and got out, stretching my stiff legs, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing it all in. The forest was alive with subtle sounds, birds calling to each other, the distant rush of the stream, the wind brushing through branches. I didn't notice the first sign that things might not be quite right. At first glance, the cabin looked empty, but then I noticed the faint scrape marks near the doorframe. I dismissed them as wear from years of weather. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, a little damp but not unpleasantly so. The living space was small, a rough table in the center, a stove in one corner, and a woodpile stacked against the wall. There were 2 bedrooms, a small bathroom, and a loft that I assumed was for extra sleeping space. It was cozy, exactly what I had been hoping for. I set down my bag, ran a hand over the rough wooden surfaces, feeling the grain, and took a deep breath. For a few hours, I just explored the space, checking the stove, the cupboards, the water supply. Everything seemed functional, though the electricity was limited, and the internet didn't reach this far out, which I had expected. I felt a sense of satisfaction, the quiet thrill of having a place entirely to myself. Night came quickly. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, and the forest transformed. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and the sounds of nocturnal life began. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig, the faint hoot of an owl. I lit a small fire in the stove, the warmth spreading through the cabin, the flames casting jittering shadows on the walls. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans warmed over the fire, and washed it down with water from the tap. Then I settled in on the porch with a blanket, watching the darkness deepen. The stars were incredible, uncountable, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a ribbon of light. I felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you are utterly alone in the right way. Then I noticed something, a sound, faint at first, barely perceptible over the wind and the night, a movement in the trees below the cabin, near the edge of the stream. I strained my eyes, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was an animal, deer perhaps, or a fox, and I returned inside. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, my pulse quickening slightly at the sudden awareness of isolation. I went to bed early, the bed firm but adequate, and tried to sleep. The sounds outside were constant but indistinct, shuffling, snapping twigs, the occasional thud. It took me hours to fall asleep, my mind spinning scenarios, all realistic but unsettling. In the middle of the night, I woke to a louder noise, a scraping sound at the edge of the cabin. My heart hammered, and I froze, listening. Footsteps? No, heavier, dragging, deliberate. I got out of bed slowly, every movement careful, and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything, just dark shapes swaying in the moonlight. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and went outside, shining it toward the stream. The beam caught a glimpse of something moving, but it vanished almost immediately. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a bear, but the movement had been deliberate, calculated, different from the erratic behavior of wild creatures. I returned inside and locked everything, sitting by the stove, a large kitchen knife in hand, listening. Morning didn't bring relief. I went outside to inspect the perimeter and found footprints. Human footprints, large, deep, and fresh, leading from the tree up to the cabin and disappearing around the back. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here last night had left without entering, or had they? The back door had scrape marks, faint but present. I checked the windows. Nothing broken, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I considered leaving immediately, but the dirt road I had come on was washed out in places from recent rains, and my car might get stuck. I rationalized staying put until I could safely drive out, but I made a mental plan. I would be alert, check the cabin constantly, and prepare for any confrontation. Over the next 2 days, the tension built. I rationed food, kept firewood stacked, and spent hours reinforcing the doors with whatever I could find. Chairs, sticks, a heavy table. Every noise outside made me jump. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the call of a bird that sounded strangely loud. I refused to sleep more than a few hours at a time, taking turns between sleeping lightly and keeping watch. I started noticing signs that someone had been near the cabin repeatedly. More footprints, disturbed dirt near the water, subtle marks on the trees, as if someone had been measuring or watching. My imagination raced, but I forced myself to stick to observable facts, cataloging every detail, keeping a mental log of patterns. On the third night, the sense of being watched became unbearable. I sat in the cabin with every light on, the knife beside me, the flashlight ready. Around midnight, I heard movement close by, heavier than before. This time, I could hear a low sound, like gravel being shifted, deliberate steps approaching the porch. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. The doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then more forcefully. Someone was trying to get in. I slammed my shoulder against the door, the wood groaning but holding. The knob rattled again. I realized they might have a tool, something to force the lock, and panic surged. I remembered the loft. The cabin had a small loft above the living area, accessible by a ladder. I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with essentials, water, food, a first aid kit, and the knife, and climbed into the loft, locking the hatch above me. From my vantage point, I could see the front of the cabin dimly, hear the intruder's movements, smell the damp night air mixed with the faint scent of someone who had been in the forest. Hours passed. I couldn't see much, but the noises persisted. Scraping, shifting, quiet footsteps pacing around the perimeter. My body ached, but I stayed hidden, listening. Eventually, the sounds ceased. I waited until dawn, too exhausted to even hope, the adrenaline leaving me weak and shaky. Daylight brought no immediate relief. I could see tracks leading away from the cabin into the woods, but they were erratic, fading quickly into undergrowth. I decided I could not stay any longer. I packed quickly but cautiously, moving from room to room to ensure I had everything and that there were no surprises waiting. The back door had been tampered with, more deeply than I realized in my panic, but nothing was missing. I left the cabin, my eyes constantly scanning the treeline, following the same dirt road I had used to arrive. The drive back was nerve-wracking. Every sound, every shadow made me tense. I stopped twice to check for footprints. I had been looking for a quiet place to spend some time alone, away from the noise of the city, the endless routine of work, and the constant pull of people needing something from me. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in the woods about 4 hours from where I lived. The pictures looked simple but comfortable. A wooden porch, a fireplace, a small bedroom, and no neighbors in sight. The idea of being alone in the woods sounded perfect. I drove up on a Friday morning. The roads grew narrower the deeper I went, and by the last hour I was driving on a winding path of dirt and gravel that cut through thick trees. I passed no houses, no cars, not even a sign that people lived anywhere near. The farther I drove, the quieter it became. Even with the windows closed, I noticed the silence. My car engine was the only sound, and when I stopped at the cabin and turned it off, the silence felt even heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The cabin itself looked just like the pictures. A single-story structure with a dark brown roof, weathered wooden walls, and a small porch with 2 steps leading up. There was no fence, no shed, no other buildings. Just the cabin in the middle of tall trees that swayed slightly in the light breeze. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The living room was small, with 2 chairs, a sofa, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a while. The kitchen was tucked into the corner, with a gas stove, a small fridge, and a counter that had a few scratches from years of use. The bedroom was even smaller, with a narrow bed and a dresser. There was a bathroom with running water, which I was thankful for, though the pipes groaned when I turned the sink on. I spent most of the first day unpacking and walking around the area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods, and I followed it for about a mile before turning back. The forest was thick, with old trees that blocked a lot of the light. Even in the afternoon, it looked dim under the canopy. I noticed animal tracks in the mud along the trail. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear, though I wasn't sure. I kept an eye out, but I saw nothing moving except birds. By evening, I sat on the porch with a drink in my hand and listened to the quiet. I thought I might hear insects or distant animals, but there was nothing. No buzzing, no howling, no rustling, just silence. It was peaceful at first, but the longer I sat, the more unnatural it felt. I realized how used I was to background noise in the city. Cars, voices, sirens, music from apartments, something always filling the air. Out here, it was only me and the woods. That night, I cooked a simple meal on the stove, read a book for a while, and then got ready for bed. I left one small lamp on in the living room because the darkness in the woods outside was heavy. almost solid, pressing against the windows. With the lamp on, the cabin felt less isolated. I lay down in the bedroom, listened for any sound, and eventually fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. The clock said 2:13. At first, I wasn't sure why I woke. Then I noticed the lamp in the living room was off. I knew I had left it on, but the cabin was now completely dark except for the faint moonlight through the window. I thought maybe the power had gone out. I sat up and listened. The silence was still there, thick and heavy. I told myself it was nothing, just a power flicker, but I couldn't fall back asleep for a while. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was outside the cabin, standing in the woods, watching. When I finally did drift off, my sleep was restless, filled with shallow dreams I couldn't remember clearly. The next morning, the power was back. The lamp clicked on when I touched the switch. I brushed it off, made some coffee, and tried not to think about it. I planned to hike more that day, maybe go farther down the trail. The woods in daylight looked less threatening. I walked for hours, deeper into the forest. The trail thinned out, and at one point I wasn't sure if I was even on a real path anymore. I came across a clearing with fallen trees and moss covering everything. I stopped there to rest and drink some water. The air felt damp and cool, even though it was almost noon. Again, I noticed the lack of sound. No insects, no distant animals. Only the faint wind moving the branches. When I finally headed back, it was later than I planned. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dropping behind the trees. The cabin looked smaller than before, more fragile, almost swallowed by the woods around it. That night, after dinner, I sat inside reading. Around 10, I heard something outside. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze. The sound came again, then stopped. I set the book down slowly and turned off the stove fan to listen better. The silence was so complete that even the faint sound of my own breathing felt too loud. I sat there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. I told myself it could be an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. The forest was full of them. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of someone walking slowly around the cabin, just out of sight. Eventually, I forced myself to check. I picked up the flashlight I brought with me, stepped onto the porch, and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, showing only trunks, branches, and patches of undergrowth. Nothing moved. I listened, but there was no sound now, not even the faintest rustle. I stood there longer than I needed to, shining the light in every direction. Finally, I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down again. My chest felt tight, and my skin prickled like something had been watching me. I barely slept that night, waking every hour to listen. The next day, I thought about leaving, but I had booked the cabin for the weekend, and part of me felt foolish. It was just a cabin in the woods. People stayed in them all the time. I convinced myself I was letting my imagination get out of control. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day close to the cabin instead of hiking. I walked in circles around it, studying the ground. I saw tracks, but they weren't clear. Some could have been deer. Some looked too wide, too flat, almost like the sole of a boot pressed lightly into the dirt. That night was the worst. I tried to sleep, but woke up to another sound. This time, it was a faint scrape along the side of the cabin. Wood against metal. I held my breath. It happened again, closer to the window. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The sound stopped after a while, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I lay in bed, frozen, until dawn light finally came through the window. When I got up and checked, I saw faint marks on the wooden wall outside. Thin, uneven scratches, too high up to be from an animal. They looked like someone had dragged something sharp along the wood. My stomach turned cold. I knew then it wasn't animals. Someone had been outside the cabin. Someone was out there, moving around while I slept. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't care about staying the full time anymore. I wanted to leave, but when I started the car, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't start. I lifted the hood, though I knew nothing about engines. Even I could see the problem. The wires had been cut. My hands shook. Someone had done this while I was inside. I rushed back into the cabin, locked the doors, and sat in the corner with the flashlight in one hand and the heaviest object I could find in the other, a metal fireplace poker. The silence pressed harder than ever. I waited, straining to hear any sound. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, felt like it meant something. Hours passed. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I felt the air leave my chest. The steps stopped at the porch. I stared at the door, my whole body trembling, waiting for it to open. It never did. After a long time, the footsteps moved away. I sat there until the sun came up, my eyes burning from not blinking enough. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I gathered the last of my strength, packed only what I could carry, and left the cabin on foot. I followed the dirt road back the way I came, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, convinced someone was behind me. It took hours, but eventually I reached the main road. A car finally came by and I flagged it down. The driver stared at me like I was half crazy, standing there in the middle of nowhere with a backpack and a wild look in my eyes. I didn't care. I asked him to take me as far as the nearest town. When I looked back down the road, the cabin was hidden by trees again, as if it was never there. But I knew what happened. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, moving around the cabin while I slept. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. I never went back for the car. I never went back for the rest of my things. I left it all behind. The memory of that silence in the woods, the footsteps in the dark, and the scratches on the wall has stayed with me. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't rent cabins. I don't seek silence. I learned that being alone doesn't mean being safe. Out there, I had been planning to take a short trip away from the noise of the city for months, and the cabin seemed like the right choice. It sat deep in the woods, far away from any towns, about a 2-hour drive from the last stretch of paved road. I rented it through a small listing that was buried on the internet, a plain advertisement with a few pictures and a short description. The photos showed a wooden structure with a tin roof, a wraparound porch, and a single light above the door. The inside looked simple: one bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bathroom with running water from a well system. Nothing fancy, but I wanted quiet more than anything else. The drive there was rough. The dirt road twisted through endless trees, and my tires slid over gravel in some spots. I had to slow down several times when branches had fallen across the road, scraping against the bottom of my car as I drove over them. The deeper I went, the less I felt connected to the outside world. Cell service was gone before I even reached the halfway point. By the time I saw the cabin appear through the trees, I felt like I had entered a different place, completely cut off from the rest of the world. The cabin itself looked just like the pictures. It had weathered wood on the outside, patches of green moss creeping up the lower logs, and the porch sagged slightly as though it had held the weight of many years of snow and rain. There was a metal chimney sticking up from the roof, leaning just slightly to one side. I parked the car off to the side where the dirt cleared enough to make a small space and carried my bags inside. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of damp wood. Dust had gathered on the windowsills, and the floorboards creaked under my steps. The kitchen had an old propane stove with 4 burners, a chipped counter, and a single cabinet filled with mismatched plates and cups. The bedroom had a small bed with a frame that looked handmade, a thin mattress, and a quilt folded at the foot. The bathroom was tiny, with a sink, a toilet hooked up to a septic tank, and a shower with rusty fixtures. The whole place felt old and worn, but livable. I unpacked and set things up. My plan was simple: stay for a few nights, read the book I had brought, take some walks in the woods, and just be away from people. I thought it would be relaxing, a reset for my mind. But the first night told me it wasn't going to be that simple. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down. The woods grew darker quicker than I expected, the trees closing in until only a narrow strip of orange was visible in the sky. When it finally disappeared, it was black. There were no streetlights, no glow from houses or cars, just pure darkness pressing in against the small cabin. I turned on the single porch light, and it illuminated only a few feet of ground before the dark swallowed everything else. The quiet was the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It was too deep, too heavy. Every sound stood out sharply. I could hear the groan of the trees in the wind, the occasional snap of a branch, and sometimes faint movements in the brush that I couldn't see. I told myself it was animals, probably deer or raccoons, but being alone out there made every sound feel closer and more threatening than it probably was. When I went inside for the night, I locked the door and checked the windows. The locks were old, small latches that didn't look like they could stop much if someone really wanted to get in. Still, I fastened them and tried to push the thought out of my mind. I lit the wood stove to warm the cabin and lay down on the bed, listening to the crackle of the fire. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time the fire shifted and popped, I opened my eyes. Every gust of wind that rattled the walls made me sit up and listen. At one point, I swore I heard faint footsteps on the porch. Not the creak of shifting wood from wind, but something heavier. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour, and finally I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The porch boards were damp from the dew, but I noticed faint marks near the steps. Scuffed patches where dirt looked disturbed. They could have been from me dragging my bags yesterday, but I didn't remember leaving marks like that. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself it was nothing. The day went by slowly. I walked a little way into the woods, careful not to lose sight of the cabin. The trees seemed endless. No trails, no clearings, just thick growth in every direction. It was beautiful in a way, but it also made me uneasy. If I got turned around, I knew I could wander for hours without finding my way back. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and cooking simple food. But as night came again, the uneasy feeling returned. It grew worse when I noticed something strange. On the porch rail near the corner, there were fresh scratches. Not animal scratches, not the random kind left by branches or weather. These were straight, deliberate lines cut into the wood, about 6 inches long, 3 of them side by side. I ran my finger over them, and the edges were sharp, fresh, like they had been made recently. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't made them, and they weren't there yesterday. That night was worse. The sounds outside came back, louder this time. I heard movement circling the cabin, crunching over leaves, stepping onto the porch. The wood groaned under weight, slow, heavy steps moving right past the window near the kitchen. I sat in the dark with the fire low, frozen, listening to the sound of something walking just feet away from me. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to move the curtain. The steps went away after a while, fading into the woods. I stayed awake all night, my body tense, my ears tuned to every sound. When daylight finally came, I opened the door and looked around. The porch boards had more marks now. Fresh dirt ground into the wood, and the scratches on the rail looked deeper, like someone had dragged a knife or a sharp tool across them again. I knew then that I wasn't alone out there. Someone was coming to the cabin at night. I thought about leaving, packing my bags and driving out right then, but I hesitated. The road back was long and rough, and if whoever it was out there wanted to follow me, I would be trapped in my car with nowhere to go. I decided to stay one more night, but to be ready. I kept my flashlight and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace close to me. That evening, I sat with the lights off, staring out the window into the dark. Hours passed, and then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps again. Slow, steady, deliberate. They came from the woods, moving closer until they reached the porch. The boards creaked as weight pressed onto them. My chest pounded as I watched the doorknob shake slightly. Once, then again, as though someone was testing it. I gripped the poker tight in my hands, my mouth dry. The knob rattled harder, then stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and heavy. After a long minute, the steps moved again, this time around the cabin, brushing against the walls, circling. I followed the sound from room to room, careful to stay low, watching the windows. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shape outside, tall and thin, passing just beyond the glass before disappearing into the dark. I didn't sleep at all that night, When morning came, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed everything quickly and carried it to the car. But when I reached the driver's side, I froze. The dirt around the tires was covered in footprints. Bare footprints. They circled the car, pressed deep into the soil, some small, some larger. Whoever it was had been walking around my car while I was inside. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and got in. I started the engine and drove as fast as the road would allow, the tires slipping on gravel, the car bouncing hard over ruts. I didn't stop, not even when branches scraped the sides of the car. Not until I saw the paved road again and knew I was finally out. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I thought about it, the scariest part wasn't the noises or the scratches or even the footprints. It was knowing that whoever it was, they had been watching me from the woods. They had been close enough to touch the walls, close enough to carve the porch rail, close enough to stand outside my windows while I sat in the dark inside. And the whole time, I never knew what they wanted. I never knew how long they had been there before I even noticed. And I'll never know. I had been planning the trip for months, though at the time I didn't realize how unprepared I really was. The idea had seemed simple at first. A few days alone at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods, away from the noise and distractions of the city. I wanted silence, peace, and the chance to think clearly. I had imagined mornings spent drinking coffee while the fog lingered over the trees, afternoons walking on trails, and evenings sitting by a fire with a book. I hadn't thought about the isolation itself, the kind that presses down on you when no one is around for miles, and the way the woods at night can feel alive in ways that make your stomach tighten. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected. Google Maps had underestimated the back roads, and as the city faded behind me, the roads grew narrower and rougher. The trees on either side formed a dense wall, their branches twisting together in a way that blocked most of the sunlight. Occasionally, I passed a small creek or a patch of farmland, but for the most part it was just endless trees and winding roads. I remember noticing the silence first. Not the kind of quiet where you just don't hear cars, but a deeper silence, the kind where your own car engine sounds loud and intrusive, where the wind in the trees is the only sound for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I had hoped for and more. It was a small, wooden structure with a peaked roof and a chimney, set on a slight rise overlooking a thin stream. The porch creaked under my weight, and the wooden door had that faint, musty smell of a place that had been closed up for months. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with basic appliances, a living area with a couch and a wood stove, a bedroom with a thick comforter on the bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. I unpacked slowly, setting things down in deliberate order, almost ritualistically, as though this small act of organizing could ward off the sense of unease that had begun to settle in my chest. The first night was the hardest. I had expected it, but it was worse than I imagined. The wind howled through the trees, slapping branches against the roof and sides of the cabin, and every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard someone moving outside. I told myself it was just the wind, that the old cabin groaned and shifted in ways that made sounds. But it was impossible not to notice how sudden and sharp some of the noises were. Somewhere in the distance, an animal barked or yipped, and I realized I had no idea what it was. There was a part of me that wanted to open the door, to see, to confront it, but another part knew that doing so would be reckless. I stayed in bed, listening, until exhaustion finally carried me into a shallow sleep. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores and exploration. The cabin came with firewood stacked neatly under a small shed, and I spent the morning carrying logs into the cabin, stacking them by the stove. Each time I went outside, I noticed how isolated the cabin really was. From the clearing around it, I could see nothing but trees in every direction. There were trails in the woods, but they were narrow, overgrown in places, and it was easy to imagine losing your way if you weren't careful. I walked a few of the paths, marking them mentally so I could retrace my steps. Birds and small animals moved quickly through the underbrush, but larger signs of life were rare. By evening, the isolation began to press down on me. I was careful to keep the fire going, and I spent hours chopping and stacking wood to make sure I wouldn't run out. But even with the fire, the cabin felt colder than it should have been. The walls were thin, and I could hear the creaking of the cabin and the whisper of the wind outside. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. I knew logically that the nearest neighbor was miles away, and that someone approaching the cabin without being noticed would take time. But the knowledge didn't stop my heart from racing when I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I would check, see nothing, and tell myself I was imagining it. I wasn't used to being completely alone like that. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I wanted to see the stream more closely, and the map included a small path that followed it for a few miles. The trail was rough and sometimes indistinct, covered with fallen leaves and branches, and it forced me to pay attention to where I was walking. The stream itself was narrow but fast-moving, the water clear and cold. I followed it for about an hour, noting the patterns of the rocks and the way the light hit the water. I began to feel a strange sort of anxiety creeping in, a tension I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was that same feeling you get when you realize you've gone somewhere unfamiliar and that, despite all precautions, something could happen that you were not prepared for. By mid-afternoon, I decided to head back. The trail had meandered farther than I expected, and I had a vague sense that I hadn't marked my path as well as I should have. The woods were dense, and without paying close attention, it was easy to step off the path onto loose ground or uneven terrain. I started to notice subtle changes in the environment. Broken branches that hadn't been there before, unfamiliar animal tracks, and a feeling that the trees themselves were closing in. I knew logically it was just my mind, heightened by the isolation, but it didn't make it any less intense. It was only a matter of minutes before I realized I had lost the trail. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest all looked the same. Every tree seemed familiar and yet slightly different. The stream that had guided me before now seemed like just another line of moving water, impossible to follow without getting wet. I felt a tightness in my chest as I tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths and focusing on sounds I knew I could trust. The trickle of water, the wind, the distant call of a bird. Hours seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I started marking trees with sticks and scratching marks in the bark, hoping it would help me navigate. As evening approached, panic started to set in. The sun was low, and the shadows were long, turning the forest into a confusing maze of shapes. My phone, which had decent signal back at the cabin, showed no bars. I realized that if I didn't find the cabin before dark, I could be stuck in the woods all night, exposed to whatever might be out there. My legs were starting to ache, and every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. I thought about shouting, but the sound of my own voice in the woods sounded alien, almost threatening. I began moving more cautiously, trying to follow the faint sense of direction I had. It was around this time I first noticed that I wasn't alone. At first, it was just small signs. A branch that had been moved, the sound of something breaking underfoot behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds didn't match anything I had seen before. They were heavier, deliberate. I began to walk faster, but the sounds seemed to quicken with me, always just out of sight. The forest, once beautiful, had become a trap, and I felt my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Night fell fully, and I was still lost. I had tried backtracking and then trying new directions, but nothing worked. Every path led me deeper into the woods. I was exhausted, hungry, and scared in a way I hadn't thought possible. I finally found a small clearing and decided to stay there, hoping to gather my thoughts. I crouched low, trying to stay quiet, listening to the sounds around me. Something was definitely moving, something larger than a deer, but I couldn't see it. I thought about the stories of people getting lost in the woods, about bears or cougars, and the thought of being trapped and exposed terrified me. I remembered the cabin and forced myself to focus on the memory. The stream, the rise the cabin sat on, the path that had led me there. At dawn, I started moving again, deliberately this time, using the sun to guide me. I moved slowly but carefully, paying attention to every detail, every landmark I could remember. Hours passed like this, the forest unchanging, oppressive, and vast. I stumbled more than once, my legs shaking from exhaustion, my hands scratched and bleeding from branches. I kept moving because I knew that staying in one place meant I could be trapped forever. Finally, in the late afternoon, I saw it. The edge of the clearing, the roof of the cabin peeking over the trees. Relief hit me like a wave, washing away the terror that had gripped me for the last 24 hours. I ran the last few hundred meters, collapsing on the porch, trembling and shaking from exhaustion. I took stock of my situation. I was scratched, sore, dehydrated, and hungry, but I was alive. I built a fire and tended to my wounds, the simple act of sitting by the stove calming me more than I thought possible. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in months, but I didn't forget the fear that had gripped me. The isolation, the unknown, and the sheer intensity of the forest had taught me a lesson. Nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent and can be dangerous in ways you might not expect. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin, exploring only small sections of the nearby woods, marking paths carefully and always making sure I could see the cabin from wherever I went. By the end of the week, I had grown more comfortable, more respectful of the environment, and more aware of my limitations. I had learned to recognize the sounds of I had decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small cabin that I had rented deep inside the woods. The cabin was old but sturdy, built from thick logs and standing on a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. I had always wanted to get away from the noise of the city, to find some peace and quiet where I could think, write, and simply be alone with myself. I imagined long, quiet days, mornings filled with the sound of birds, nights filled with the smell of wood smoke and the comfort of a warm fire. I thought it would be relaxing, maybe even refreshing, but what I experienced during those days was nothing close to what I had planned. It turned into something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The cabin was about 2 miles away from the nearest dirt road. I had parked my car at a small clearing near a gate, then carried supplies in using a hiking trail that was barely visible in some places. The cabin had no electricity and no running water, but it had a wood stove, a pump well outside, and an old propane lantern hanging by the window. I had brought enough canned food, dried meals, a few jugs of water, and other basic supplies. My plan was simple: cut wood, write, read, and walk the trails during the day. I wanted silence. I wanted to test myself by living away from people for a while. The first 2 days were quiet, almost perfect. But slowly, things began to shift. The first signs were so small I almost ignored them. I would leave the axe leaning against the chopping block, and the next morning I found it lying flat on the ground a few feet away. I thought maybe I had left it that way. The door to the shed, which I was sure I had closed and latched, was found slightly open one evening. I thought wind had done it, even though the latch was heavy. At night I heard noises, snaps of twigs, rustling of leaves, movement outside, but I told myself it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear wandering close. It was the woods. Noises were normal, but after a few days, the noises seemed too close, too slow, too steady, like steps, like someone moving carefully around the cabin. By the end of the first week, I had grown more alert. I started double-checking every lock, making sure windows were shut tight, leaving nothing outside that could attract animals. I tried to dismiss the feeling of unease, but it grew heavier with each night. There were times I woke up in the dark, completely still, because I felt like someone was standing outside the cabin, listening. The silence that followed those moments was worse than the noises themselves. The second week was when things became more clear and more terrifying. One afternoon, I went down the trail to gather kindling. When I came back, I noticed something strange on the front steps of the cabin. It was a boot print, not mine. It was larger than my own, pressed clearly into the thin layer of mud that had settled after a small rain the night before. I froze when I saw it. I hadn't seen anyone else in days. Nobody was supposed to be this far out, and I knew the prints weren't old because the rain would have washed away anything from before. Someone had been right there at my cabin, walking up to the door while I was gone. That night, I could barely sleep. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind brushing against the walls, sounded like footsteps. I kept the propane lantern burning until it nearly ran out. At some point, I sat in the chair by the window watching the treeline. The woods looked black and endless. I kept thinking about that footprint, about how someone had stood there. I imagined them trying the doorknob, peeking through the window, maybe even circling the cabin while I was gone. I tried to convince myself it was a hunter, maybe lost, maybe just curious, but it didn't sit right. Hunters didn't walk up to someone's cabin uninvited. The next morning, I checked the area again. I found another print behind the cabin, near the woodpile. It was faint but still there. That confirmed what I feared. It wasn't an accident. Someone had been moving around the cabin, probably watching. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they had been out there during the nights I heard those noises. I started keeping the axe inside with me. I also set a chair against the door at night, not because it would hold against anyone trying to force their way in, but because it would at least make noise and wake me. My nerves were frayed. Every night felt longer than the last. Every sound seemed sharper. I barely slept. My body grew sore and tired, my mind restless. I thought about leaving, but the hike back to my car was long, and part of me didn't want to believe I was in real danger. I told myself I was imagining it, letting fear get the better of me. But fear has a way of showing you the truth, even if you try to bury it. It was on the 10th night when things escalated to a point I couldn't deny anymore. I was lying in bed, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling. The lantern had gone out earlier and I didn't bother lighting it again. That was when I heard it, slow, steady steps in the leaves outside circling. I held my breath, listening, heart hammering so loud it almost drowned out the sound. Then I heard a scrape, like something brushing against the wall, moving along the logs of the cabin. My mouth went dry. I gripped the axe handle tightly, every muscle tense. The steps stopped near the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I felt the presence right there, just on the other side of the glass. Someone standing silently, listening for me, waiting. Minutes dragged by, heavy and endless. Then, finally, the steps moved again, fading into the woods. When daylight came, I checked outside. On the dirt just beneath the window, I saw fresh prints. The boot marks were clear, pointing directly at the cabin wall. Whoever it was had stood right there in the middle of the night, watching. My chest tightened as I imagined it. The days that followed were a blur of fear. I kept trying to act normal, chopping wood, cooking, walking short distances, but I could never shake the feeling of eyes on me. Every sound in the trees felt directed at me. I became paranoid, checking the treeline constantly. I started sleeping in short bursts, axe by my side, boots on, ready to run if I had to. On the 12th day, I found something worse. Behind the cabin, on the woodpile, someone had placed a small pile of stones. They were stacked in a neat little tower, balanced carefully. I hadn't done it. Nobody else should have. It was a message, silent but clear. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the cabin, and they wanted me to know it. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random anymore. Whoever it was, they were playing with me, watching me, testing me. By then I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag with only what I could carry: food, water, my knife, and the axe. I planned to leave the next morning, walk the 2 miles back to the car, and get out of there. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the chair, axe across my lap, staring at the door, waiting for dawn. But just before sunrise, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were not careful, not slow. They came directly to the cabin, crunching leaves, breaking sticks, fast and heavy. My heart leapt into my throat. The steps stopped right outside the door. The handle rattled, hard. Someone was trying to open it. The chair against the door jumped slightly with the force. I gripped the axe so hard my hands hurt. Then silence. For several long minutes, nothing. I didn't move. Then I heard the steps again, moving away into the trees. When the sun came, I opened the door slowly. On the ground just outside was a boot print, sharp and fresh. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, shouldered it, and started down the trail. I didn't look back at the cabin. My only thought was to reach the car. The walk was the longest 2 miles of my life. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone following. When I finally reached the car, My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before I managed to get the door open. I drove without stopping, without looking in the mirror, until I was miles away from those woods. Even now, sitting safely far from that place, I can still feel the weight of those nights pressing on me. Whoever it was, they never revealed themselves, never spoke, never attacked outright. But they didn't need to. They let me know I was never alone, that they could reach me whenever they wanted. The cabin, the woods, the silence. It all became their tool, and I was trapped in it. I left with my life, but the fear stayed with me. And I know, without any doubt, if I had stayed just one more night, I would not be here to tell this story. I had taken trips out into the woods before, but I had never stayed alone in a cabin for more than a couple nights. When I booked the small cabin far out in the forest, I told myself it would be good to disconnect from the noise of the city. The cabin was old, but it looked solid in the photos, and the listing said there was no cell service for miles. That was what I wanted. I had no plans besides reading, cooking simple meals, walking the trails, and getting some sleep. The drive out took longer than I thought. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road that wound through thick trees, barely wide enough for my car. The sun had already started to sink low, and the shadows stretched out across the road like long black arms. The place was far from anything. I hadn't passed another car for the last hour. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked on the side of a small clearing. The cabin was made of dark wood, one story, with a short front porch. The roof sagged in places, but it looked sturdy enough. The air was colder than it had been when I left home, and I could smell damp earth and pine. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single main room with a bed against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a small kitchen area with an old fridge that ran on gas. A bathroom sat behind a narrow door. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked through. There were 2 windows, both with thin curtains, and a back door that led out into more trees. It was quiet. No sound of cars, no voices, just wind moving through branches. The first night was uneventful. I cooked pasta on the gas stove, sat at the small table with a book, and listened to the faint sound of the forest outside. Before bed, I walked out onto the porch. The night sky was black and thick with stars. I stood there until the cold made me shiver. Then I went inside, locked the doors, and crawled into bed. The silence felt heavier than I expected. In the city, even in the middle of the night, there was always some background noise. Here it was different. When the wind died, there was nothing. I lay in bed listening to my own breathing, staring at the dark ceiling until I finally drifted off. The second day, I explored a trail behind the cabin. It was overgrown, narrow, and wound down a slope into thicker woods. I walked for hours, following game tracks and the faint line of the trail. The woods seemed endless. I kept looking over my shoulder, not out of fear, but just because the stillness made me feel like I wasn't alone. I saw no one. By the time I returned, it was late afternoon. My legs were sore and I was ready to rest. That evening, after cooking, I sat on the porch again. I thought I heard something in the distance, a faint crack of wood, like someone stepping on a branch. At first, I brushed it off as deer or maybe a raccoon, but then I heard it again, closer this time. The sound stopped as soon as I focused on it. I stood there for a while, staring into the tree line. The woods were a wall of black shadows. I couldn't see anything moving. Eventually, I went back inside, locked up, and tried to sleep, but I kept waking through the night, listening. Once, I swore I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. The third day, I decided to stay closer. I read most of the morning, then chopped some wood from the small stack by the shed. The shed was just a few feet from the cabin, old and leaning, filled with tools that had been left by whoever owned the place. I split logs until my shoulders hurt, then carried them inside. In the afternoon, I walked a short distance down the dirt road that had brought me in. I wanted to see if there were any other cabins nearby. After almost an hour, I hadn't seen a thing. No tire tracks, no houses, no signs of people. I turned back, uneasy at how isolated the place really was. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sound of branches breaking came again, closer than before. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but it didn't sound random. It sounded like footsteps, careful but heavy enough that I knew it wasn't something small. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every muscle tight, waiting. At some point, I fell asleep. When I stepped outside the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. In the dirt just beyond the porch, there was a footprint, clear as day, bigger than mine, made by heavy boots, pointed straight toward the cabin. I froze. I scanned the clearing, the tree line, the roof, everywhere. Nothing, just silence. My hands shook as I crouched to look closer. The footprint wasn't there yesterday. It was pressed deep, like someone had been standing there, watching. The whole day felt wrong. I stayed inside, peeking out the curtains, listening for anything outside. I didn't hear much, but every time the wind shifted, I thought I caught the faint smell of smoke, like a campfire. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. By evening, I knew I wasn't imagining it. When I stepped onto the porch before dark, I saw more footprints along the side of the clearing. They circled part of the cabin, leading into the trees. Whoever it was had been walking around while I slept. I barely slept that night. I pushed a chair under the front door handle and kept the hatchet I used for wood next to the bed. Every little sound snapped me awake. At one point, I thought I heard the back door knob move, slow and careful. But when I sat up, everything was still. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my bag in a rush, heart hammering, and carried it out to the car. That's when I saw it. Mud smeared across the back window of my car. A handprint, clear and deliberate. I dropped the bag and ran back to the cabin. I didn't know if whoever was out there was watching me right then, but the thought made my skin crawl. I paced the cabin, breathing hard, thinking about what to do. The road out was long, narrow, and easy to block. If someone wanted me stuck here, they could make it happen. For hours I sat at the table, staring at the window, listening. The woods felt alive, pressing in on every side. I thought about the footprint, the handprint, the sounds. None of it made sense except for one thing. Someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. That night was the worst. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. I held the hatchet tight in my hand, my heart slamming against my ribs. The steps moved across the porch, then stopped by the door. The knob turned once, rattled, then silence. I stayed frozen in bed until dawn, not moving, barely breathing. When light finally came through the curtains, I crept to the door. On the wood right above the knob was a fresh scratch, long, thin, and deliberate, as if made with a knife. That was enough. I grabbed my bag, ran to the car, and started it without even looking back. As I pulled out of the clearing, I checked the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a figure standing just inside the shadow of the forest, watching. I didn't slow down. I drove the narrow dirt road faster than I should have, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they ached. Every time I passed a bend, I expected to see a truck blocking the way, but it never came. After what felt like forever, the dirt turned to pavement. My chest loosened only when I saw the first gas station an hour later. I pulled in, got out, and just stood there under the bright lights, shaking. The world felt strange, loud, and safe all at once. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't tell many people what happened, because it sounded crazy when I said it out loud. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Someone had been out there watching me, circling me, waiting. And the worst part is not knowing why. I had rented the cabin thinking it would give me peace. For months, I had been buried under work, and all I wanted was a break where I could sit in silence, away from the noise of cars and phones and the endless chatter of the city. I picked a place that was far from everything, a small wooden cabin built years ago, tucked between tall trees on the edge of a forest. The closest road was a dirt path that stretched 3 miles from the highway, and once you drove up, you couldn't see another house or person. That kind of distance gave me comfort at first. Felt like freedom. When I first pulled up in my car, I noticed how still the air was. The trees seemed endless, standing like guards around the property. The cabin itself was old, but not falling apart. It had a small porch with steps leading up to it, 2 windows in the front, and a door with peeling paint. I walked around the outside before even stepping in. There was a shed off to the side, its roof sagging slightly, and a rusted water pump not far from it. The woods behind stretched in every direction, thick and dark. You couldn't see far into them because of how close the trees grew together. I stood there for a while, listening. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking, not even a plane overhead. Only wind and the occasional creak of branches. Inside the cabin was plain. A single room with a small kitchen space on one end, a fireplace against one wall, a bed in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. There was a bathroom, but the water came from the pump outside, so I would have to carry buckets in. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I walked around, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I unpacked slowly, setting my bag on the bed, laying out food supplies on the counter, and stacking firewood near the fireplace. By evening, I was sitting on the porch steps, watching the trees shift in the breeze. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. Silence. Nothing but me and the woods. The first night passed without trouble, though I didn't sleep well. The silence was so heavy that it made me aware of every small sound. When a branch cracked outside, I would wake up instantly. When the wind pushed against the cabin and made it creak, I thought someone was moving inside. I had lived in noise for so long that silence itself felt unnatural, almost threatening. But I managed to drift in and out, and by morning the light slipping through the window eased my nerves. The days blended together at first. I would wake with the sun, make a small fire to boil water for coffee, and sit outside while I drank it. I would walk through the woods during the day, following animal paths and marking trees so I wouldn't get lost. The air was crisp, the sky wide open above the gaps in the trees. I kept telling myself this was what I came for. To be away from people, to breathe in air that didn't smell like exhaust fumes, to let my mind clear itself out. At night, I cooked simple meals on the fire, wrote in a notebook, and read until I felt my eyes grow heavy. It was calm, almost too calm. But by the 4th night, I started to notice things. Small things that I wanted to ignore but couldn't. That night, I was lying in bed when I heard something that wasn't the wind. It was faint, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. A crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I froze, listening hard. Came again, steady, slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin. But it was too even, too heavy. Deer move quickly, their hooves scatter across the ground. This was slower, heavier. Human. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled around the cabin. I could hear them moving past the window, then fading toward the back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I didn't move until the sound was gone. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to come back. Didn't. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, but near the back of the cabin I saw faint impressions in the dirt. They weren't clear enough to show detail, but they looked like shoe prints, not hooves or paws. I stared at them for a long time, trying to reason it out. Maybe a hunter had wandered close, maybe someone hiking the woods, but there was no trail near the cabin. This was private land, or at least it was supposed to be. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake it. All day I felt eyes on me. When I went into the woods, I kept turning around, sure I would see someone standing between the trees. I found nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. By the time the sun set, my nerves were raw. I kept checking the door lock, making sure the windows were latched tight. I stacked extra wood inside, not wanting to step out in the dark. I barely ate. That night I heard it again. Not just footsteps this time, but something brushing against the wall of the cabin. A dragging sound, faint but steady. My whole body tensed as I lay there in the dark. Then came a sound that made my chest tighten. It was the door handle, moving. Someone was trying it. I held my breath, praying the lock would hold. The handle rattled lightly, then stopped. Silence stretched out, long enough for me to think maybe they were gone. Then the footsteps moved again, circling, slow, deliberate. They stopped near the shed. I waited, straining my ears, but nothing else came. When the morning light finally crept in, I stepped outside again. My hands were shaking as I checked the shed. The door was closed, the lock still in place, but the ground in front of it was disturbed. More shoe prints. Someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't an accident. Someone was out here, coming around the cabin at night. For what reason, I didn't know, but the thought alone made my stomach twist. I considered packing up and leaving, but part of me resisted. I had come here to be alone, to prove I could handle it. I didn't want to run at the first sign of trouble. So I told myself I would stay one more night, but if it happened again, I would leave in the morning. That night, I barely let myself blink. I sat up in bed with the lantern burning low, my ears tuned to every sound. Hours passed, and nothing came. I started to think maybe it was over, maybe whoever it was had moved on. But just as I let myself relax, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, the slow approach. My skin prickled all over as the footsteps came right up to the window. I could hear breathing now, faint but steady, just on the other side of the glass. I didn't move. I sat frozen, eyes locked on the dark outline of the window, heart hammering. After a long minute, the breathing stopped. The footsteps faded, moving back into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping a heavy piece of firewood like a weapon, my throat dry, every muscle tense. When daylight came, I made my decision. I packed up quickly, shoving clothes and food into my bag without care. My plan was simple: get in the car, drive back down the dirt road, and not look back. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. My car tires were slashed, all four of them, deep cuts through the rubber, flat to the ground. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing against me. Whoever had been circling the cabin wasn't just watching. They didn't want me leaving. All right, I understand. You want a 7,000 plus word first-person scary cabin story in one single piece, with no supernatural or fantasy elements, no converse. I had been looking forward to spending a week alone in that cabin for months. The thought of getting away from everything, no traffic, no constant noise, no people around me, had been pulling me through the stressful weeks leading up to it. The cabin was small, tucked in the woods, about 2 miles from the nearest dirt road where I left my truck. It was the kind of place that felt completely separated from the rest of the world. The only things out there were tall trees, a narrow trail, and silence so deep that even the smallest snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. I brought enough supplies for the week: canned food, rice, pasta, a few packs of dried beans, a small propane stove, water jugs, a heavy flashlight, spare batteries, a hatchet, and a hunting knife. I also brought a sleeping bag, a thick blanket, and a small first aid kit. The cabin itself was bare bones, just 4 walls of weathered wood, a roof that sagged slightly under the weight of years of snow, and one small window in the front. Inside was a single room with a wood stove in the corner, a narrow cot, and a table with 1 chair. It wasn't much, but I liked that. I wanted simple. I wanted silence. The first 2 days went by quietly. I spent my time gathering small firewood from the forest floor, splitting logs with the hatchet, and cooking simple meals. I hiked a little, staying close to the cabin, making sure I always knew the trail back. The nights were the hardest. The forest got so dark that when I stepped outside after the sun went down, it felt like I was stepping into a bottomless pit. The trees absorbed all light, and the silence pressed down on me. Even the small creaks of the cabin settling at night made my chest tighten. But I told myself it was normal, that I just wasn't used to being so far from everything. By the 3rd night, I started noticing small things that unsettled me. The first was when I went out to grab more firewood from the small pile I kept stacked against the side of the cabin. I always made sure to stack it neatly, but when I stepped out with my flashlight, the pile looked different. Some of the logs were shifted, and 2 were lying on the ground, as if they had been pulled out. I told myself it must have been me earlier in the day. Maybe I didn't stack them properly, or maybe one slid off and knocked the others down. Still, I felt uneasy about it. Later that same night, I was inside reading by lantern light when I heard a noise outside. It was faint but sharp. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a branch falling. It was something deliberate, a crunch on the frozen ground. A step. I froze, holding my breath. My eyes locked on the small window, but I didn't see anything. The sound didn't come again, so after sitting still for what felt like half an hour, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer passing by. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were tracks in the dirt and leaves just a few feet from the door. Not animal tracks, boots. Clear tread marks leading from the trail to the side of the cabin. They stopped near the woodpile, then circled around to the back wall. My stomach dropped as I followed them. They went right up to the small back wall of the cabin and stopped under the window. Whoever it was had stood there, watching, maybe while I was inside reading. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. The cabin that had felt safe now felt like a trap. The woods around me no longer seemed peaceful. They seemed endless and full of places for someone to hide. I walked the tracks back to the trail, but they disappeared into the forest in a direction that wasn't the path I had taken in. Whoever it was, they hadn't come from the road. They had been moving through the woods. That day I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the window, listening for every small sound outside. I kept the hatchet near me even when I cooked. By evening, I had worked myself into such a state that I didn't want to light the lantern, afraid it would draw attention. I sat in the dark with only the faint glow of the fire in the stove. That night was worse than the one before. I didn't sleep. I lay in the cot with my knife gripped in my hand under the blanket. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps outside. Slow, deliberate. My chest pounded so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The steps moved around the cabin, stopping every few feet. I knew they were circling. At one point, I heard a faint scrape against the wall, as if someone had brushed their hand against the wood. Then silence. Long, endless silence. When the faint gray light of dawn finally came, I sat up and forced myself to go outside. My hands shook as I opened the door. The ground was damp, and the tracks were clear. They went around the entire cabin. They stopped at the front door, just feet away from where I had been lying inside. I told myself I should leave, pack up and head back to my truck, but the thought of walking 2 miles through the woods with someone out there following me felt worse than staying put. At least in the cabin, I had walls around me, thin as they were. I told myself I would wait until morning, then leave when I could see more clearly. The fourth night came and I barely held myself together. I built up the fire, but I didn't use the lantern. I sat at the table with my back against the wall, the hatchet resting on the wood beside me. My body was tense, my muscles ached from holding still. Hours passed. Then, the sound I had been dreading, footsteps again, crunching on the dead leaves. Closer this time. I held my breath. The steps came right up to the door. I could see the faint shadow under the crack where the moonlight hit. Someone was standing there, not moving, just standing. Minutes passed. Then came the soft sound of the door handle, a tiny, deliberate rattle as if testing it. My stomach twisted so hard I felt like I would throw up. The door was locked, but it was only an old metal latch. If they pushed hard enough, it would give. I stood slowly, knife in one hand, hatchet in the other, my heart pounding. The handle stopped rattling. Silence again. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, I opened the door and saw it. A fresh set of tracks. Clear boot prints right up to the door, then back into the woods. They had tried to get in. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing food, water, and the lantern into my bag. I strapped the knife to my belt and carried the hatchet in my hand. Every sound in the forest made me snap my head around. I kept expecting to see someone just out of sight. The trail back to the truck felt twice as long. Every step I took, I glanced behind me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my truck, my chest loosened just enough to breathe again. But when I got closer, I stopped. There were tracks around the truck. Fresh boot prints circling it, the same tread pattern I had seen around the cabin. Whoever had been at the cabin had followed me before. They had been here, waiting. The driver's side door handle had fresh scratches near the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open. I felt sick, realizing that if I had come back in the middle of the night, my truck might not have even been there, or worse, they might have been waiting inside it. I opened the door with shaking hands, slid in, and locked it immediately. I started the engine, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest stood silent, tall, endless. I put the truck in gear and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road, not stopping until I hit the highway miles later. The relief I felt then wasn't real. It wasn't comfort. It was only distance. Even now, when I think back, I don't know who it was or why they had been there or what they wanted. All I know is that someone had been watching me that whole time, circling the cabin at night, waiting for the right moment to come inside. That cabin no longer feels like escape to me. It feels like a place I barely got out of. A place where the walls were too thin, the nights too long, and the silence too heavy. And when I remember the footsteps circling outside, I know one thing with certainty. If I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I drove for hours on the narrow road that wound up through the trees, the sound of gravel under the tires filling the silence inside the car. The sun was already dipping low behind the hills, and the light was fading faster than I had expected. I had left later than I should have, thinking I would still have plenty of time to reach the cabin before it got dark. But the road was longer and more twisted than it looked on the map. I kept glancing at the dashboard clock, knowing that daylight was slipping away, and I wanted to get settled before night came. The cabin was a small place I had rented online. It was meant to be a quiet weekend away from everything. Just me, the woods, and the calm I thought I needed. It wasn't supposed to be fancy, just a simple old wooden cabin, a roof, a bed, and a stove to cook on. The photos had shown it tucked deep in the forest with no neighbors in sight. That was exactly what I thought I wanted at the time. But as the car climbed higher and the road got rougher, I started to feel a little uneasy. The woods pressed in close, the trees crowding both sides, and I realized how far I was getting from anything familiar. When I finally reached the turnoff, it was barely marked. A faded wooden post leaned to the side with the number painted on it, half the paint peeling away. The dirt track that led off the road looked more like something for an ATV than for a car, but I drove down it slowly, the branches scraping the sides. After a few minutes of weaving through trees and bumping over roots, the cabin came into view. It was small and plain, just weathered wood and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The porch steps were uneven, and the windows looked clouded with dirt. There was a clearing around it, but not much, and the forest stood heavy and dark all around, cutting off most of the horizon. I parked the car in the patch of dirt that served as a driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy in the air. No birds called. No wind stirred the branches. I felt like I had stepped out of the world I knew and into something cut off and forgotten. I got out, stretched my legs, and carried my bag up the steps. The wood creaked under my weight, and I noticed how brittle the railing felt when I touched it. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and dust. The furniture was simple: an old wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, a small wood stove in the corner. Everything looked worn down but serviceable. I set my bag on the bed and went back outside to take in the surroundings before the last of the light was gone. The clearing was small, maybe 20 feet across before the trees closed in again. Beyond that, the woods looked thick and endless. The trunks were so close together it was hard to see more than a little way in, and the ground was a mess of roots, fallen branches, and moss. I walked around the cabin slowly, testing the air, listening for anything. I thought I would hear birds settling for the night, or at least the rustle of something moving, but it stayed strangely still. That quiet settled deeper into me, making me feel watched though I saw nothing. I decided to go back in and get things set up before it was fully dark. I lit the small lantern the cabin had, set out the little bit of food I had brought, and tried to get comfortable. but the stillness pressed through the thin walls. Every creak of the cabin as it cooled made me pause. I knew it was just the old wood shifting, but out here, away from everything, each sound felt sharper. When night finally fell, it was heavy and absolute. The forest outside turned black, no lights in the distance, no glow from anywhere. The lantern flickered and cast long shadows across the rough wooden walls. I ate quietly, my ears tuned to every groan of the old structure. At one point, I thought I heard something faint outside, like a branch snapping, but when I held my breath and waited, nothing else came. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer, but I couldn't shake the unease. The trees outside looked like a wall, and beyond that wall, I felt something could be standing, listening, waiting. I locked the cabin door, even though the lock looked flimsy, and checked the windows, though they didn't have proper latches. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I lay on the thin mattress, staring into the dark, listening. The silence was deep, but every so often I thought I caught small noises, like faint steps in leaves or something brushing against wood. Each time I sat up, straining to hear, and each time there was nothing after. My chest stayed tight, my skin prickled, and I felt exposed even though I was inside. When morning finally came, gray light seeping in through the dirty windows, I felt drained. I stepped outside into the cold, damp air, expecting to see tracks or something disturbed in the dirt around the cabin, but it all looked the same. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had been out there. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I gathered wood from the edge of the clearing, tried to read the old book I had brought, and made a small fire in the stove. For a while, it almost felt normal, though the silence of the forest never lifted. Even in the day, no birds sang, and no squirrels chattered. I didn't realize how much background noise from nature I was used to until it was gone. The quiet here felt wrong, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. As the second night came, my unease grew heavier. I checked the door twice, made sure the lantern had enough oil, and tried to steady myself. But again, once the dark took over, the quiet pressed in close. I lay on the bed, trying to convince myself to sleep, when I heard it again. A faint crunch outside, the sound of weight on leaves. This time it wasn't just once. I lay frozen as it came again, then a pause, then again closer. Slow, deliberate steps circling. My breath caught in my chest. The thin walls suddenly felt like paper. I stared toward the window but could see nothing beyond the black glass. My mind tried to tell me it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving cautious through the trees. But the steps were too slow, too heavy, like someone walking barefoot, careful with each step. I stayed like that for hours, every muscle tense, my ears straining, until the sounds finally faded. When dawn broke, I was still awake, my heart still racing. I forced myself to go outside, my hands shaking. The dirt around the cabin was uneven with leaves and pine needles. Not easy to read, but I swore I saw impressions. Not clear footprints, but something pressed the ground. By then, I wanted to leave, but the cabin was far out, and I told myself it was in my head. I had come here for quiet, for escape, and maybe my mind was just playing tricks after being cut off from everything. I tried to convince myself of that, but the truth was my nerves were wearing thin. The third night was the worst. It started the same, silence wrapping tight around the cabin. Then the sounds began earlier. The steps again, slow and steady, circling. At times they stopped, and I felt eyes on me even though I couldn't see. Then they started again, closer. At one point, I heard the soft scrape against the wood of the wall, right by the window. My chest felt like it would burst. I thought I saw a shadow move past the faint lantern light leaking through the glass, but it was too dark to be sure. I gripped the handle of the small hatchet I had brought for wood, my knuckles white. I stayed like that the whole night, clutching it, waiting, heart pounding so hard it made my head ache. When the sun finally came, I made up my mind. I packed my bag fast, stuffed everything back into the car, and left. The road out felt longer, twisting and endless, but I kept driving, glancing in the mirror again and again. The trees pressed close until I finally reached the main road. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never found out what it was. Maybe it was a person, someone living wild out there, watching. Maybe it was just my mind twisting the quiet into something that wasn't there. But the truth is, I know what I heard. Those were steps, slow and steady, circling the cabin in the night. I never went back, and I never will. I had always thought that renting a cabin far out in the woods for a week would be a quiet escape. I wanted silence, time away from the constant noise of town, and a break from the screens and traffic that always seemed to fill my head with static. I found a small place listed online, tucked deep into the forest several hours away from the nearest highway. The pictures made it look cozy. A single-story wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, a narrow porch, and a view of the trees all around. Seemed peaceful, simple, and isolated. Exactly what I thought I wanted. When I finally arrived, I was struck by how quiet it was. The drive down the dirt road had been rough, the kind that shakes your car so much you wonder if something is going to break. There were no other cabins nearby, no neighbors I could see. Just endless trees, tall and thick, pressing in around the clearing where the cabin stood. The cabin itself looked older than the pictures had suggested. The wood was darker, weathered, and the roof sagged slightly at one end. Still, it was standing, and it looked like it could hold out against the wind and the rain, which was all I needed. Inside, it was plain. A single main room with a bed pushed against the wall, a small kitchen area with an old refrigerator and stove, a wooden table, and the fireplace in the center. There was a bathroom attached, though the plumbing looked old. Everything smelled faintly of dust and the dry, earthy scent of wood that hadn't been aired out in a while. I set my bags down and told myself I would get used to it. After all, this was the point. To be alone, away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees and quiet. The first day passed without trouble. I unpacked, put some food away, and explored the area immediately around the cabin. There was no phone signal, but I had expected that. The air felt cooler and fresher than in town, and I tried to enjoy it. By evening, I lit a fire in the fireplace, sat on the old couch with a book, and listened to the flames crackle. The silence outside was so complete that I felt almost unnerved by it. I told myself I would get used to that too, but the silence was not complete. Every so often, I heard things, a twig snapping somewhere in the trees, a rustling of leaves that went on longer than I thought the wind could explain. I tried to ignore it. Animals, I told myself. Squirrels, deer, maybe a raccoon or two. This was the woods, of course there were animals. But even as I reasoned with myself, I couldn't shake the way those sounds seemed deliberate, like steps, not just random movements. That night, when I went to bed, I left the fire burning low and tried to sleep. The mattress was lumpy, the sheets a little musty, but I eventually drifted off. Sometime in the dark hours of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized I had heard something, a sound outside, close to the cabin. It wasn't the high, fast scurry of a small animal. It was heavier. It crunched against the ground slowly, steadily, like someone walking. I lay still, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then again, a step. Another step. I held my breath. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer. They could be heavy enough to make that kind of noise. But then there was the sound of wood creaking, like one of the steps on the porch outside. My stomach turned cold. I stayed in bed, too afraid to move. The sound didn't last long. Just a few steps, then silence. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe some animal sniffing around. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the dark ceiling, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I walked out onto the porch. The ground was damp from dew, and I looked around automatically, searching for tracks. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, near the steps of the porch, I saw impressions in the dirt. They weren't hoof prints. They weren't paw prints either. They were footprints, human footprints, bare feet pressed into the soft earth, leading from the trees toward the porch, then back again. I stared at them for a long time, my chest tight. The prints looked fresh. The edges were still sharp, not worn away by wind or time. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my cabin while I was inside sleeping. I told myself it could have been a hiker, someone passing through, curious about the cabin. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The cabin was miles from the nearest trail. Who would be wandering barefoot in the woods this deep, this far from anything? I tried to push the thought away. I made breakfast, tried to read, went for a short walk in the woods. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They stayed in my mind all day, and when night came, I felt a rising unease settle in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left the fire burning brighter, thinking maybe the glow would comfort me. I lay in bed listening, every creak of the cabin making me stiffen. Hours passed. At some point, I thought I heard it again, steps outside, faint but deliberate. I froze, my body stiff under the blanket. The sound stopped, but then came again on the porch. Creaking wood. I didn't move. My eyes stared at the ceiling, my hands gripping the sheets. The steps came closer, slow, heavy. Then I heard it softly, almost like a brush of skin on wood. Something touched the door. Faint scrape. Pause. Another scrape, like fingertips dragging across it. I stayed like that, not daring to breathe too loudly, until at last the sound faded. The steps went back across the porch, down into the dirt, and then silence. When morning came, I went outside again. The footprints were there again, fresh, closer this time, right up to the door. My heart pounded as I stared at them. Someone had been there, right outside while I lay frozen in bed. I thought about leaving then, packing up, driving back to town, forgetting the whole idea of this trip. But I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was someone camping nearby, curious, wandering around at night. It was possible. The woods were big. People did strange things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I drove for hours before reaching the old logging road that cut through the forest. It was late afternoon, the kind of time where the shadows stretched long across the gravel, and the heat from the sun still lingered even though the air already hinted at evening chill. My plan was simple. Stay alone for a week in the cabin I had rented from a man I barely knew, clear my head, and try to reset my thoughts away from noise, phones, and the constant weight of city life. The cabin was far from town, at least an hour's drive back to the closest store. The road leading there was rough, filled with potholes, and the trees grew thick on both sides, pressing in close. By the time I finally saw the clearing with the cabin, I felt relief just to know I had made it without puncturing a tire or bottoming out my car. The cabin was small and plain, a single-story structure with weathered wood, a sagging porch, and a tin roof that looked like it had fought off decades of storms. There was no electricity except for a small generator the owner had left behind, and water came from a pump just outside. I had brought enough food, lanterns, and basic supplies to last me. I had even made sure I had a few extra cans of gas for the generator, though I planned to use it sparingly. The first day passed calmly. I unpacked, set my things neatly in the one bedroom, and checked through the cabin to make sure everything worked. The pump groaned but gave water. The old wood stove in the corner still had a pile of cut logs stacked nearby, and the windows, though cloudy and smudged, opened and shut if I worked them. I remember standing on the porch that evening, listening to the wind in the trees and the sound of crickets starting up as the light faded. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet compared to what I was used to. But the quiet did not last long. That first night, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint at first, a kind of crunching sound, like footsteps on leaves. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was just some animal. The forest was full of deer, raccoons, maybe even bears. But what unsettled me was how steady the sound was. It was not the random movement of an animal sniffing around. It had rhythm, the slow, deliberate kind of rhythm that came from someone walking. I stayed still, listening until it stopped. My heart thumped in my chest as I waited for it to start again. But after a few minutes, the forest returned to its usual hum. Eventually, I forced myself back to sleep, though it was restless. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The dirt around the cabin was dry, scattered with leaves and pine needles, but I thought I saw something faint. Shapes in the dirt that could have been boot prints. They weren't clear enough to know for sure, and I told myself it was probably just my imagination, my brain turning normal marks into something else because I had been half asleep and nervous. Still, the thought stuck with me all day. I tried to shake it off. I spent time chopping some extra firewood, organizing the supplies inside, and taking a short walk down a path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The further I went, the more I realized how alone I was. There were no distant cars, no houses, nothing. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch under my own feet. That second night, I had trouble sleeping. I lay awake longer, listening harder. The noises started again sometime past midnight. The same sound, footsteps outside, slow and dragging. I heard them circle the cabin this time, moving from one side to the other, then fading before coming back again. I didn't dare move. I didn't even sit up. My body froze, every muscle tight, ears straining for every sound. At one point, I heard the creak of the porch boards. That made my skin crawl. I had walked on that porch enough to know how it sounded, and the weight of a person was different from a stray animal. The steps on the porch came slowly, one after the other, until they stopped. Whoever or whatever it was stood still out there for a long time, not moving. I lay in bed gripping the blanket, hardly breathing, praying for it to end. When morning came, I checked again. The boards on the porch looked the same and I found no clear tracks. But the air felt different now. The cabin no longer felt like a safe retreat, felt like a place being watched. The next few days blurred together. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, that I was just not used to being alone in the woods. But each night, the same thing happened. Footsteps in the dark, circling the cabin, stopping, sometimes scratching faintly on the wood, sometimes tapping against a window, never rushing, never breaking in, just a slow torment that left me exhausted and paranoid. I stopped sleeping properly. I would doze off for minutes at a time before jerking awake at every sound. I kept the lantern close, but I never turned it on when I heard the noises, because part of me feared that showing light would confirm to whoever was out there that I was awake and alert. On the fourth night, something changed. I had just managed to fall into a deeper sleep when I woke to a sharp sound. Metal against metal. My stomach dropped as I realized what it was. The pump outside. It squeaked faintly when used, and that was the sound I heard. Someone was pumping water in the middle of the night. I forced myself up quietly and moved toward the small window above the sink that faced the pump. I barely lifted the curtain, just enough to peek out. The moonlight was dim, but it was enough to see a figure bent over the pump. It was not clear in detail, just the outline of someone tall, thin, moving with purpose. My chest tightened. That was no animal. That was a person. I froze there at the window, barely breathing, until the figure stopped, stood still for what felt like forever, then walked off into the trees. The next day, I was shaken. My food supply was fine. My car still sat where I had left it at the edge of the clearing, but the fear now felt heavier. Someone was out there. Someone was not just passing by, but spending their nights circling my cabin, using the pump, making their presence known without ever confronting me directly. It felt deliberate, like a slow game meant to wear me down. I thought about leaving that day. I even packed some things into my car, but part of me hesitated. The cabin was paid for, I was supposed to stay a week, and driving back down that rough road late in the day felt dangerous too. I told myself I could handle one more night, then leave in the morning. That night was the worst. I barely turned off the lantern before the noises began again. The footsteps were louder, less cautious. The tapping on the windows turned into firm knocks, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. At one point, I heard the doorknob rattle. I sat in the bedroom, holding the small hatchet I had used earlier for chopping wood, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound of the doorknob twisting back and forth went on for a long time, then stopped. Silence followed. A silence so heavy I thought maybe it was finally over. But then the sharp creak of the bedroom window came. I whipped around and saw the frame shudder slightly, as if someone was pressing against it from outside. My heart pounded as I gripped the hatchet tighter. The pressure stopped after a moment, but I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at that window, afraid it would give way. When dawn came, I made my decision. I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded the car. I didn't bother to eat or even check the cabin thoroughly. I just wanted to leave. The road out felt longer than before, every turn of the tires seeming too slow, every shadow between the trees making me think I was being followed. But eventually, the forest thinned, and the gravel turned back to pavement, and I knew I was out. By the time I reached town, the relief was overwhelming. I returned the cabin key to the owner without explaining much, just that I had to cut the stay short. I didn't want to sound paranoid or insane trying to describe the nights I had endured. To this day, I don't know who it was out there. Maybe some drifter living in the woods. Maybe someone who enjoyed tormenting anyone foolish enough to stay alone in that cabin. What I do know is that it was real. The footsteps, the pump, the doorknob, the window, they weren't in my head. Someone was there every night, watching, waiting, testing the edges of my fear, and I left before they decided to push further. I had been waiting months for this trip to the cabin. The whole idea of getting away from the noise of town, from people, from work, from everything, had been sitting in my head for so long that by the time I actually parked my truck on the dirt clearing and stepped out into the still air, it felt almost unreal. I had stocked up for the stay carefully. Food that could last 2 weeks, water containers, a small first aid kit, extra clothes, lanterns, batteries, a rifle with some rounds just in case of wild animals, a small axe, and a knife. I thought I had planned for everything. The cabin was small, tucked deeper into the woods than most people would bother going. It had been built by a man decades ago, and I had arranged to rent it from someone who claimed to be his grandson. The cabin itself was simple. A single story with a small porch, one main room, and a little kitchen area. The bathroom was an outhouse behind it. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. The windows had shutters, and the single door was heavy with a rusted latch. I liked it that way. Felt private, closed off. I unloaded everything from the truck slowly, putting each item in its place. I knew once I parked the truck behind some brush down the old dirt track, no one passing by would even know I was there. That was the point. I wanted no one to know I was there. The first day passed without anything unusual. I settled into the cabin, got the lanterns ready for nightfall, and gathered some wood for the small fireplace. By evening, the forest outside had grown darker than I expected. The trees around the cabin were tall and thick, letting in little light. Once the sun dropped, the woods looked like a wall of blackness pressing against the windows. I sat inside on the old wooden chair, eating canned food with a spoon straight from the tin. The silence was heavier than I thought it would be. No cars in the distance, no voices, not even a plane. Just the occasional crack of branches and the faint sound of wind moving through leaves. By the time I was ready to sleep, I noticed how thin the walls of the cabin really were. Every sound from outside leaked in. At one point in the night, I woke up to what I thought was the sound of footsteps in the brush. Slow, deliberate crunching on leaves. My body went tense in the dark. I held my breath and listened. It lasted maybe half a minute, then faded. I told myself it had to be a deer. I forced myself to believe that until I fell back asleep. The second day, I explored the woods around the cabin. I followed a faint game trail that wound deeper among the trees. I carried the rifle just in case. The air was cool, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles. After a while, I reached a clearing where the trees opened up, and sunlight touched the ground. I stood there for a long time, enjoying the warmth. Felt better than the dark shade near the cabin. While looking around, I noticed broken branches on the edge of the clearing. They were snapped in a way that didn't look natural. They had been stepped on, pressed down hard. I crouched and saw a footprint in the dirt. Not an animal, a shoe. It wasn't mine. I froze and stared at it. The size looked average, maybe close to mine, but it wasn't fresh. The edges had dried and cracked slightly, maybe a few days old. My first thought was that someone else had been out here before me. Hunters maybe, or hikers. Still, it made me uneasy. This cabin wasn't on a normal trail. Whoever had been here had no reason to be this far unless they knew about the place. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the thought. I double-checked the locks on the shutters and the door. They weren't much, but it made me feel a little safer. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. A faint scrape, then silence. Then another, like fingers or branches dragging along the wall. I gripped the rifle and lay in bed without moving. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would echo in the room. I wanted to get up, to check through the window, but I didn't. I stayed still until the sound stopped. Morning came, and I forced myself to look outside. The ground around the cabin was disturbed. Leaves and soil had been shifted, as if someone had walked slowly around the entire structure. I followed the faint trail a few feet, but it vanished into the trees. My skin prickled as I imagined someone standing out there at night, circling, listening, maybe watching. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to. I had prepared for this trip, wanted the peace of the cabin, wanted the time away. I convinced myself it could still be an animal, maybe a bear rubbing against the wood. The days that followed blurred into each other. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the rifle near at all times. The woods grew heavier, darker. The silence pressed harder against my ears. At times, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Not clear, not enough to be sure, but enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck. Sometimes it looked like a shadow shifting, sometimes like the shape of a man. One afternoon, I walked a short distance from the cabin to gather more wood. While bending to pick up a branch, I noticed something wedged into the bark of a tree. It was a nail, old, rusty, hammered in at shoulder height. On it hung a piece of torn cloth, weathered but still visible. The way it was placed felt deliberate, not natural, not accidental. I pulled the cloth free and stared at the nail. It unsettled me deeply. It was as if someone had left a mark, a sign that they had been there, that they owned that space. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lantern on, though its light barely pushed back the darkness. Every small noise set me on edge. A twig snapping, the creak of wood, the shifting of wind. I thought about the footprint, the nail in the tree, the cloth. I thought about the sound of steps circling the cabin. I realized I wasn't alone out here. Whoever else was in these woods wasn't just passing through. They had been here before. They knew this cabin. Maybe they even used it when no one was around. And now I was the intruder. On the fifth night, I heard it again. Footsteps closer than before. This time, they didn't circle. They stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy. I gripped the rifle so tightly my hands ached. I didn't move. For what felt like hours, I sat frozen, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. It never did. Eventually, the breathing faded, but I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I started packing my supplies, loading them back into the truck. My hands shook the whole time. I had the sense that whoever had been out there at night knew I was leaving. The woods felt different, heavier, like they were closing in. I hurried, shoving things into bags without order. When I stepped behind the cabin to grab the last container, I froze. In the dirt, right by the outhouse, was a fresh footprint. Clear, sharp edges. Someone had been there during the night. It wasn't mine. It faced the cabin. Panic pushed through me. I didn't finish packing. I carried what I could and loaded it fast. My eyes never stopped scanning the tree line. Every dark patch between trunks looked like someone standing there. By the time I climbed into the truck and turned the engine, sweat soaked through my shirt. The sound of the motor felt too loud, echoing through the trees. I drove as fast as the dirt track allowed, bouncing over rocks and holes, branches scraping the sides. In the mirror, the cabin shrank, then disappeared behind the trees. I didn't slow until I reached the paved road miles away. Only then did I breathe properly again. Later, when I finally stopped at a gas station far from the woods, I got out and stretched my legs. That's when I saw it. On the back of my truck, near the tailgate, smeared into the dust of the paint, were the marks of a hand. Clear, large prints dragged down the metal. They hadn't been there when I packed. That was the moment I knew it hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been there, close enough to touch my truck, close enough to watch me leave. I had stayed in that cabin thinking I was hidden, thinking no one would find me. But the truth was the opposite. Someone had always known I was there, and they had let me know only when they wanted to. I never went back to that cabin again. I remember the day I decided to go to the cabin. It was in the middle of a long stretch of weeks where my mind felt heavy and the noise of the city was beginning to drain me. I had rented the place for a week, far from town, tucked inside thick forest with only a narrow dirt road leading up to it. It was supposed to be quiet, simple, and away from everything that was pulling me down. I thought it would be the perfect break. The pictures online showed an old but solid wooden cabin with a front porch, a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom that ran on a water tank system. The area around it looked isolated, with only trees, hills, and rough terrain. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was already long. I left early in the morning while the sun was just coming up and didn't arrive until the middle of the afternoon. The last stretch of road was a dirt path that twisted through the woods. My car bounced and rattled as it climbed over rocks and potholes. By the time I finally saw the cabin, I felt relief wash over me. It stood alone at the end of the road, the forest pressing close on every side. There was no other house in sight, no noise of traffic, no sign of people. Just the cabin, the trees, and the faint hum of insects in the summer air. The cabin looked old but not falling apart. The wood was dark and weathered, and the porch sagged slightly under its own weight. The front steps creaked when I walked up them. Inside, it smelled of old pine, dust, and something faintly damp, like it had been closed up for a while. The furniture was simple: a couch with worn cushions, a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves with random mugs and pans, and a single bed with a thin mattress in the small bedroom. The bathroom was plain but functional, with a tank system that I was told to refill with rainwater if it got low. There was no TV, no internet, and only a small radio that sat on the counter. I felt strangely good about all of it. This was what I had wanted: quiet, no distractions, just me and the woods. I unloaded my things from the car slowly, taking in the silence around me. The woods stretched in every direction, thick with pine and oak, the ground covered in brush and fallen branches. The air was still, broken only by the call of a bird here and there. For a while, it felt peaceful. I thought I had made the right decision. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on the small gas stove, sat on the porch, and watched the trees sway in the evening breeze. As the sun went down, the woods darkened quickly. The cabin didn't have many lights, and once the lamps inside were on, the windows reflected my own image back at me instead of letting me see outside. I tried not to think too much about that. I went to bed early, tired from the long drive. That was the first time I noticed the quiet in a way that made me uneasy. Lying on the bed, I listened. At first, I thought I would hear the normal sounds of the forest at night: crickets, frogs, maybe an owl. But it was almost completely silent. The silence felt heavy, like it pressed against the cabin walls. I lay there, eyes open, waiting for something, and eventually I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I decided to walk around the area to get familiar with it. I followed the dirt road back a little, then cut into the woods. The ground was uneven, with thick undergrowth in some areas and patches of bare earth in others. I didn't go too far, just far enough to feel surrounded. The woods seemed endless. The air smelled of pine and earth. It was calm, but every now and then, I thought I heard something. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves. At first, I thought it was animals, maybe deer, squirrels, or something else. I brushed it off, though I found myself turning my head a lot, scanning the trees. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. Near the back of the cabin, in the dirt, there were marks. They looked like footprints, faint but there. The ground was hard and dry, so they weren't clear, but they seemed fresh enough. I crouched down and looked closer. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, pressed deeper into the earth. I tried to think of what could have made them. Maybe the owner had been here recently. Maybe it was some hunter passing through. Still, something about the sight of them unsettled me. I went inside and tried not to think too much about it. That night, the silence was even heavier. Lying in bed, I thought I heard something outside. At first it was faint, like a soft crunch on the ground, then gone. I sat up, holding my breath. The cabin was still. I listened for a long time, then slowly lay back down. My heart was beating faster than normal. I told myself it was just an animal, but the unease stayed with me. Over the next 2 days, little things began to add up. I would walk outside in the morning and notice that something seemed moved. Once it was a chair on the porch, angled differently than I had left it. Another time, it was a stick leaning against the cabin wall, though I was sure I hadn't put it there. I tried to convince myself I was misremembering. Maybe I had moved it without thinking. Maybe the wind had pushed the chair slightly. But deep down, I didn't believe that. By the 4th night, I was sleeping lighter than before. I kept waking up, listening to the silence. Sometime in the middle of the night, I thought I heard movement again. Slow steps, crunching faintly on the dirt outside. My whole body tensed. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. The steps seemed to circle, then fade into the distance. It was a long time before I could close my eyes again. The next morning, I finally saw something that shook me. On the porch, pressed into the thin layer of dust on the wood, was a handprint. Clear, large, and fresh. Not mine. My chest tightened as I stared at it. The fingers were long, the palm broad. It wasn't old. It had been left there last night. I stood frozen for a long time before I finally moved. I went inside, locked the door, and sat at the table trying to calm myself down. I thought about leaving. I could pack up, get in the car, and drive back to town. But the dirt road was long, rough, and I told myself I was just overreacting. Maybe some local had passed by and gotten curious. Maybe it was harmless. Still, the thought of that handprint stayed with me the entire day. That night was the worst yet. I had left a lantern burning inside the cabin because I couldn't stand the total darkness anymore. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was softer, like the creak of wood. My stomach turned cold. I realized it was the porch. Something was on it. I lay frozen in bed, my eyes wide in the dim light of the lantern. The creaking went on slowly, one board at a time. Then it stopped. I waited, my heart thudding in my ears. For what felt like an hour, I didn't move. Finally, I heard it again. Not the porch, but the faintest tap against the wall near the window. A deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't stand it anymore. I forced myself out of bed, my legs shaking, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find. An iron pan from the kitchen. I stood there, clutching it, waiting. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, the night dragged on and the silence returned. I stayed awake until the sun finally rose. In the daylight, I checked around the cabin again. There were fresh footprints in the dirt. Clear this time, pressed deep into the ground around the porch. They were from boots, large, heavy boots. Someone had been there, standing just outside while I was inside trying to sleep. I didn't care anymore about overreacting. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into bags without care. I loaded the car, my eyes darting constantly to the trees around me. The woods felt different now, not calm, not peaceful, but watching. The dirt road seemed longer than ever as I drove out. Every bump and turn made me feel like something would appear behind me or in front of me. My hands gripped the wheel tight. It wasn't until I finally saw the paved road again that I let out a shaky breath. I drove straight back to town without stopping. Even now, when I think back on it, the part that chills me the most isn't the footprints or the handprint or even the sounds outside. It's the simple fact that someone had been out there the whole time, moving closer each night. They never tried to break in. They never revealed themselves. They just stood outside in the dark, watching, waiting. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know how long they would have kept coming back if I hadn't left. But I know one thing. I will never go back to that cabin again. I had planned on spending a quiet week alone in the old cabin that sat deep in the valley, far from town, far from the noise of traffic and people, far from anything that could bother me. I had been there once before with a couple of friends during the fall, but this time I wanted to go alone. I wanted the silence, the long nights with only the sound of the wind in the trees, the chance to be away from my phone, away from work, away from everything. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle, and it had no electricity. The only things inside were a wood stove, a couple of old chairs, a table, a bed frame with a thin mattress, and some shelves with tools and supplies. The roof leaked a little when it rained, and the windows didn't close all the way. It wasn't the kind of place most people would call comfortable, but to me it felt like a real escape. I packed up everything I thought I would need. I filled 2 large backpacks with canned food, dry snacks, a couple of knives, a hatchet, a flashlight, batteries, matches, and a small camp stove with propane canisters. I also brought a sleeping bag, a heavy jacket, some blankets, and my boots. I wanted to be ready for anything because the cabin was miles from the nearest paved road, and I knew that if I forgot something important, I wouldn't be able to just run out and get it. When I arrived, I parked my car at the small clearing where the dirt road ended, then hiked the rest of the way in. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I remembered the way. After almost an hour of walking, I reached the valley. The cabin sat near a small stream that cut through the trees, and the sound of the water was steady and calming. The air felt cooler there, and the sunlight came down through the branches in patches, leaving much of the ground in shadow. I unlocked the old padlock on the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The smell of wood and dampness hit me first. Dust floated in the air where the light came through the window. The place looked exactly the same as I remembered. I set my bags down, swept the floor with an old broom I found in the corner, and unpacked my things. The first day passed easily. I walked around the valley, explored the stream, and gathered some dry wood for the stove. I heated a can of soup on the camp stove, ate it while sitting on the porch, and watched the trees sway in the evening breeze. As night fell, the forest became darker than I had expected. Once the sun dropped behind the ridge, the valley filled with shadows. I lit a lantern and kept it near me while I read an old paperback book I had brought. Later, I lay down in the sleeping bag and listened to the wind. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I wasn't used to the silence. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. I could hear the stream outside, the creaking of the cabin as the wood cooled, and every so often, a snapping branch or rustling leaves in the distance. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, deer, maybe even a bear. But still, I kept waking up and looking toward the door. The next morning, I walked farther from the cabin. I followed the stream upstream until I reached a rocky section where the water ran faster. I sat on a boulder for a while, letting the cold mist spray across my face. I wanted peace, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. It was like the forest was watching me. I knew it was just in my head, but it didn't leave. On the second night, I made a small fire outside in the fire pit. I sat beside it until late, staring at the flames, listening to the forest. That's when I first heard something strange. It was faint, far away, but it sounded like movement. Not just the random snapping of branches from an animal, but a steady crunch of footsteps. At first I thought it was a deer coming down to drink from the stream, but the sound stopped suddenly, and when I shined my flashlight in that direction, I saw nothing. I told myself not to overthink it, but the unease grew. The third day I spent chopping wood with the hatchet, trying to keep busy. I stacked it neatly beside the cabin, enough for several nights. I walked around the valley again, trying to see if there were any other trails or signs of people, but there was nothing. The trees were thick, the undergrowth heavy, and it felt like no one had been there for years. That night, the sounds returned, louder this time, the same crunching in the distance, the sound of weight moving through the undergrowth, stopping when I stopped to listen. My stomach tightened as I sat in the dark, lantern beside me, flashlight in my hand, trying to hear through the steady rush of the stream. I stayed up most of that night, too restless to lie down. When I did finally drift off near dawn, I woke to find the door to the cabin slightly open. I knew I had shut it tight. My chest went cold. Nothing seemed missing, but the thought that someone might have been inside while I slept made my skin crawl. From that moment, I couldn't relax. On the fourth day, I checked the area around the cabin carefully. I walked in circles, scanning the ground for tracks. The soil was damp in places, and near the edge of the stream I found a mark that didn't look like it belonged to any animal. It was the shape of a boot print, pressed lightly in the mud. My own boots were bigger, wider. This one was narrow, deep at the heel, pointing toward the cabin. I tried to convince myself it might have been left by someone years ago, maybe even from when I was last here with my friends. But the print looked fresh. The edges were sharp. The ground had been wet from rain just 2 days ago, so it couldn't have been older than that. That night, I didn't light a fire outside. I didn't want to make it easy for anyone to see me. I ate cold food inside, sitting in the dark with the lantern off, listening. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, closer this time, then silence. My heart hammered as I held the flashlight in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I didn't sleep at all. By the 5th day, I was on edge. Every sound set me off. I walked the trail leading back to my car just to see if everything was still there. When I reached the clearing, I felt some relief seeing the vehicle untouched, but that relief faded when I noticed something else. On the driver's side door, smeared faintly across the dusty surface, was the shape of a handprint. I stood frozen, staring at it. It was faint, but clear enough to see the outline of fingers. Someone had been there. I checked the locks, still shut, still solid. The glass wasn't broken, but the fact that someone had been close enough to touch my car made me realize I wasn't just imagining things. I hurried back to the cabin, scanning the trees, every shadow looking like it was hiding something. That night, I pushed the table against the door and stacked my bags in front of it, just to feel safer. I kept the flashlight in my hand, batteries ready, and sat up until dawn again, never letting my eyes close. On the 6th day, I knew I couldn't stay much longer. I was exhausted, my nerves shot. I thought about leaving early, but part of me didn't want to walk out through the forest alone while someone else might be out there. It felt safer, in a strange way, to stay inside the cabin where I could see only one door and 2 windows. That afternoon, I tried to rest, but the unease never left. I packed some of my things slowly, preparing to leave the next morning as soon as the sun came up. I wanted daylight for the hike back. That final night was the worst. The noises started early, just after dark. Not far off this time. I could hear snapping branches, heavy steps circling. The crunch of leaves moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. My throat went dry as I sat in the dark, clutching the hatchet so tight my hand hurt. Hours dragged by. The footsteps would fade, then return, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. Once, I swore I heard breathing just outside the wall. Near midnight, the sound of the door latch rattled. The table I had pushed in front of it shook slightly. My whole body froze. I held my breath, every muscle locked. The rattling stopped after a moment, and I sat in silence, heart pounding, staring at the door for what felt like forever. I don't know if I ever fell asleep, but at some point the noises faded, and the night passed in a blur. When dawn came, I didn't waste time. I threw everything into my bags, slung them over my shoulders, and shoved the door open. The air outside was damp, the forest quiet, the stream steady. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. I walked fast, barely stopping, eyes darting through the trees the whole time. Every sound made me turn. My legs shook as I hurried up the trail, my pack bouncing against my shoulders. When I reached the clearing, my car was still there. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I unlocked the door, threw my bags inside, and started the engine. I drove down the dirt road faster than I should have, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only then did I finally breathe. My hands trembled on the wheel. I never told my friend what happened. I never asked to borrow the cabin again. I don't know who was out there those nights, circling in the dark, but I know someone was. The boot print, the handprint on my car, the rattling door. I can't explain those away, and I had rented the cabin because I wanted silence. Life in the city had been wearing me down for months, and I thought a week away would give me some peace. The cabin sat deep in the forest, about 40 minutes from the nearest small town and at least an hour from the main highway. When I pulled up on the gravel drive the first evening, I thought I had made the right choice. It was old, but not falling apart, tucked between tall pines with a small clearing out front where the car could be parked. There was a porch that sagged a little but still held my weight as I carried in my bags. The sun was going down, and the woods around me were already dim, the air cooler than it had been back in town. I felt the quiet I had been hoping for. Inside, the cabin was simple. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. There was one bedroom with a double bed, a closet with some blankets, and a bathroom with an old sink and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used much in a while. I unpacked, set my food in the small fridge, and made a mental note that the cabin was more isolated than I expected. There were no other houses in sight, no lights anywhere through the trees, no sound of cars on distant roads. Just the wind moving through the branches and the occasional bird calling out as night came down. That first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat in the glow, eating a sandwich I had brought with me. The wood popped and cracked, and outside the forest seemed endless, dark, and alive with small movements. I tried not to think about how alone I was, telling myself that was the whole point of the trip. When I finally went to bed, I left the fire burning low. The silence pressed in on me, and I had a harder time sleeping than I thought I would. The next morning I woke early, partly from the sunlight that slipped in through the thin curtains and partly from how still everything was. I made coffee, sat on the porch and stared into the trees. They were thick, dense, and seemed to stretch for miles in all directions. I had brought a few books, some paper, and a pen, thinking I might write or read most of the time I was there. By afternoon, though, I noticed something odd. As I walked a little way down the path behind the cabin, I found fresh tracks in the dirt. They were boot prints, large and deep, as if someone heavy had walked there recently. They weren't mine. I hadn't been back there yet, and they weren't old. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or wind. They led off into the woods. At first, I told myself it must have been someone from before I arrived. Maybe a hunter, maybe the owner of the cabin checking the place. I tried not to think much of it, but something about how new the tracks were stuck with me. I hadn't seen another car on the gravel road. I hadn't heard anyone, and if someone had been that close, I thought I would have noticed. That night, sitting by the fire again, I kept glancing at the windows. The forest outside looked darker, heavier than before. Every sound seemed louder, the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was only animals, but the thought of those boot prints wouldn't leave me. On the third day, I found more signs. Near the edge of the clearing behind the cabin, a cigarette but lay on the ground. It was fresh, not old or weathered. I don't smoke. I knew I hadn't left it there. That was when the quiet of the forest stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling heavy, like it was pressing down on me. Someone had been close enough to stand just out of sight of the cabin. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself maybe it was a leftover from months ago, but it didn't look like that. The filter was clean, the paper barely weathered. By evening, I had worked myself up enough that I started checking the locks on the doors and windows more than once. The cabin's doors were old, the kind that could probably be forced open with a solid shove. I began to wonder how safe it really was. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard something. It wasn't the usual forest sound of wind or animals. It was a soft crunch, like a footstep in leaves. My body tensed. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I stayed completely still, trying not to make a sound. The steps moved across the clearing, then stopped. I couldn't see out from the bedroom, but I imagined someone standing in the dark, just outside, watching. I waited, every nerve in my body tight, listening for more. After what felt like forever, there was silence again. I didn't hear the steps retreat. I didn't hear anything at all. When the sun came up, I checked outside. There were marks in the dirt near the porch, boot prints again. Fresh. They came right up to the steps, then turned back toward the trees. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there, standing just a few feet from the door while I was inside. I spent most of that day on edge, checking the windows, walking short circles inside the cabin, telling myself to calm down. I tried to read, tried to write, but my hands shook too much to focus. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was far, and the idea of driving down that long, empty gravel road made me wonder if I'd meet whoever had been out there. That night was worse. I sat with the fire out, the lights off, just sitting in the dark listening. Around 1 a.m, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, moving around the cabin. This time they stopped by the side window. I didn't move. My chest ached from holding my breath. Then came a faint scraping sound, like fingers brushing against the wood. I stayed awake until dawn, my eyes burning, my body stiff from not daring to move. When light finally crept into the sky, I got up and checked again. The dirt outside the window showed more prints. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time. The following day, I knew I couldn't stay the full week. I began to pack, but slowly hesitating. I kept thinking about the drive out, miles of forest road where anything could happen. I had no phone signal out there, no way to call for help if something went wrong. A thought I couldn't push away came to me. What if the person wanted me to leave, wanted me out on that road? So I stayed one more night, hoping it was only my imagination, that maybe I had built it up in my head. But that night, everything became clear. Around midnight, I heard the back door handle rattle. It was faint, but I knew what it was. Someone was testing it. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and stood in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The handle rattled again, then stopped. For hours I stayed like that, gripping the poker, staring at the door, waiting. I didn't hear footsteps leaving this time. When morning came, I opened the back door slowly. The dirt there was scuffed, the handle smudged with something that looked like grease or dirt from a hand. Whoever had tried it had been real, close enough to walk right in if the lock hadn't held. That was enough. I packed everything fast, throwing my bag into the car, not caring how sloppy it was. I kept the poker with me until I locked the cabin behind me. Then I drove, fast, tires sliding on the gravel as I put as much distance between me and that place as I could. On the way out, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a truck or another car following me. The road stayed empty. When I finally reached the highway, the sight of other cars moving past me felt like the safest thing I'd ever seen. By the time I reached the town, I was exhausted, every muscle tight, my hands aching from how hard I had gripped the wheel. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there, letting the sound of people, cars, and the hum of life wash over me. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I found out from a clerk in the town that there had been reports before of trespassers in that area. Hunters who weren't supposed to be there, people camping illegally, strangers passing through. Some cabins had even been broken into when owners were away. Hearing that only made the memory worse. The truth is simple. There was someone out there moving around the cabin at night, watching. They never got inside, but they tried. And if I had stayed longer, if I had ignored the signs, I don't know how it would have ended. The silence I had wanted so badly had been broken in the worst way. Instead of peace, I had found the feeling of being prey, of being watched with no escape. The cabin still stands out there, deep in the trees, but I know better than to ever go back. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Life in the city had worn me down more than I realized, and when the chance came up to spend a few weeks alone in a cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at it. The idea of quiet, away from the constant sound of traffic, sirens, and neighbors' arguments bleeding through thin walls, felt like the only thing I needed. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who barely used it anymore, and they were happy to let me have it for the remainder of the summer. They told me it was basic, not much more than wood walls and a roof, but that was exactly what I wanted. Just a place to be alone, to breathe, and to reset myself. When I first arrived, It was everything I imagined. The cabin sat off a dirt road that twisted far into the woods, a good 30 minutes from the nearest town. The forest around it was dense, tall pines and thick brush, so heavy in places that you could only see a few feet in before it swallowed all light. The cabin itself was small, a single room with a loft above it, and a little shed a few yards away that served as storage. There was no electricity, only a small generator that I planned to use sparingly. The windows were old but sturdy, and the front porch had a wooden swing that faced nothing but trees. It felt like a place that time forgot, and I loved it immediately. The first couple of days were peaceful. I chopped some wood, swept out dust that had gathered inside, and stocked the shelves with the food I brought. I would wake up with the sun coming through the window and spend my mornings walking the trails nearby. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the forest sounds that replaced the noise of the city. Crickets, owls, the wind rushing through branches. The quiet was heavy, but it was the kind of quiet that made you feel like your thoughts had space to stretch. By the third day, I had started noticing little things, the kind of details you don't pay much attention to until they repeat themselves. The first was footprints near the cabin. Not mine, not the kind of deep boot tracks I left when I came back from hiking. These were lighter, almost careful, pressed into the dirt near the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a large raccoon or something similar, but the longer I looked at them, the clearer they became. They were shoe prints, not heavy but human. I crouched down, tracing them with my eyes. They came from the tree line, circled toward the cabin wall, then stopped as if the person had stood there for a while before turning back into the woods. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hunter passing through, or someone from town curious about the old cabin. It wasn't private property in the strictest sense, so I couldn't rule it out. Still, the fact that the prints came so close to the cabin without ever coming to the door made me uneasy. It felt like someone had come to look but didn't want to make themselves known. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself that isolation was making me paranoid. That night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first. It was faint, just outside the cabin, like a shuffle against the wall. My heart jumped, and I lay perfectly still in the loft bed, listening. The sound came again, a dragging step, then silence. I strained to hear, holding my breath, and after a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't move for a long time. I told myself it was an animal brushing against the side of the cabin. Maybe a deer. I forced myself to sleep again, though it took hours. The next morning, I went outside, more out of stubbornness than calm. The dirt around the cabin showed more tracks, the same kind of light shoe prints as before, but this time closer, circling wider, as if whoever it was had walked around the whole cabin in the night. My chest tightened. Whoever had been out there wasn't passing through. They had come on purpose, and they stayed long enough to walk a circle around me while I slept inside. I spent the day on edge. Every crack of a branch in the woods made me whip my head around. I carried the small hatchet I had been using for firewood with me, gripping it tighter than I should have needed to. I didn't leave the cabin much. I sat inside, watching through the windows, waiting to see if the forest would spit out whoever had left those prints. That night, I barely slept. I sat awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear over the sounds of the forest. The generator was off, and the only light came from a small lantern that threw long shadows on the walls. Hours passed like that. My nerves stretched thin. Sometime around midnight, I heard it again. The sound of someone outside, faint steps on the porch this time. My breath caught in my throat. I could picture the porch in my mind, only a few feet from where I lay in the loft, nothing but thin walls separating me from whoever stood there. I heard the slow creak of wood as weight shifted on the porch boards. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, then left, the sound of steps fading into the dirt. When the sun rose, I opened the door carefully. The porch showed it clearly. Footprints pressed deep into the wood dust where someone had stood, right at the door, not moving, just standing there inches away from entering. I felt sick. The thought of leaving crossed my mind. The truck was parked a little way down the dirt path. I could have loaded up my things and gone back to town, but the stubborn part of me told me I couldn't just run at the first sign of unease. Maybe it was some kid from town playing a prank. Maybe it was harmless. I told myself that again and again, but each night after, the same pattern repeated. The footsteps came back, sometimes circling, sometimes stopping at the windows. Once, I swore I heard the scrape of fingers against the glass, though when I checked in the morning, there was nothing there. My body grew tired from lack of sleep, my mind frayed at the edges. I stopped going on hikes. I barely left the porch during the day. On the 6th night, things escalated. I was lying awake, gripping the hatchet, when I heard the sharp sound of the shed door creaking open. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew I had locked it earlier with a small metal latch. I crept to the window and peered out, but the forest was too dark. The sound of movement came from the shed, then silence. Whoever it was had gotten inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I went out to check, my stomach heavy with dread. The shed door hung open, the latch bent as if it had been pried. Inside, my supplies had been rummaged through. A few tools were missing, along with some canned food. What made my chest seize was the sight of the lantern I kept in there, gone. Whoever it was had taken it, and I couldn't shake the thought that they planned to use it while watching me. By then, I knew I couldn't stay. My stubbornness had dried up, replaced with the realization that I was out there alone, with no phone service, no neighbors, and someone who clearly wanted to frighten me, or worse. I packed quickly, stuffing what I could into bags, keeping the hatchet in my grip the whole time. But when I stepped outside, I froze. Across the dirt clearing, right at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. They weren't moving, just standing still, half hidden in the shadows of the forest. I couldn't make out their face, only the outline of a man, tall and thin. My blood went cold. I tightened my grip on the hatchet, but I didn't move. The figure stayed there for what felt like minutes, then slowly stepped back into the trees until they were gone. I didn't waste another second. I threw my bags into the truck and started down the dirt road, my hands shaking so hard on the wheel that I could barely steer. Every bump in the road felt like it was slowing me down too much. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see someone running after me. It wasn't until I hit the paved road into town that I finally felt like I could breathe. My chest ached from holding it in for so long. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, where the normal sight of people moving around, filling up cars, felt almost unreal after days of isolation. I never went back to the cabin. Couldn't. The thought of it made my stomach twist. I later found out from my relative that the cabin had a history of break-ins, usually when it sat empty for too long. They assumed it was just people from town looking for food or tools. But I knew, from the way that man circled the cabin each night, from the way he stood on the porch just listening to me breathe inside, that it wasn't just someone looking for supplies. It was someone who wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And for those nights, I realized I wasn't.